Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something dark, a little absurd, and honestly just plain brutal. We're going to talk about what it would have been like to be a woman in the Middle Ages, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. If you've ever romanticised castles, candlelight, and flowing gowns, tonight's story is your wake-up call. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, what city are you in, and what time is it right now? I always love knowing who's nodding off where. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born in a cold, damp stone room. The air smells like straw, animal waste and mould, and your mother is already halfway into death's door after days of labour. No one's cheering, no balloons, no midwife with warm towels, just an exhausted woman, a filthy floor, and a prayer muttered under someone's breath. You're a girl, and that's bad news. The midwife doesn't even try to hide her disappointment. Girls don't inherit land. Girls cost money and dowries. Girls are vulnerable to everything from hunger to infection to getting snatched up by passing soldiers. Most girls like you don't make it past age 5. And if you do, you're not exactly going to be celebrated. You're going to be tolerated, trained, and possibly traded. As you lie there squirming in that rush mat cradle, the world has already decided your trajectory. You'll be married off young, probably before your voice even drops. You'll be expected to bleed monthly, give birth frequently, and remain obedient always. And even if you're clever, and you will be, you won't have much of a way to use it. No one wants a loud woman. No one wants a curious woman. They want you small, invisible, and useful. If you're lucky, your mother survives long enough to nurse you. If not, you're handed off to another woman, who may or may not be healthy, clean, or interested in helping. Breastfeeding's not just a nice bonding experience in your world, it's survival. There's no formula, no wet wipes, no bottles sterilised with hot water, just cracked nipples, exhaustion, and a lot of hope. Meanwhile, your father, if he's around, doesn't really have a say in your day-to-day. You're not his heir, and he's more invested in the pigs or a son who might show up later. If you're born into a peasant family, you'll be expected to contribute almost immediately. Toddlers pick herbs, 4-year-olds fetch water, and by the time you're 6, you're probably watching younger siblings and shoving firewood into the hearth. Now let's say you're not poor. Let's say you're born into a noble family. Congrats, your cradle is slightly less itchy, and maybe someone bathes you once in a while. But that doesn't mean your life is any easier. In fact, it comes with its own kind of nightmare. Because now your existence is transactional. Your currency with a pulse. From the moment you're born, your value is tied to which man you can be married off to for political or financial gain. You're a bargaining chip in a very expensive, very patriarchal chess game. By the age of 7, you're being groomed, not the modern-day horror story kind, although sometimes, yeah, but groomed in the you're going to be a wife or a nun way. You learn to curtsy, to embroider, to pour wine with the grace of a swan and the silence of a ghost. You're taught that your voice should never be louder than a whisper, and that reading is only acceptable if it involves religious texts. Anything more and you're considered too smart, which is basically code for trouble. Here's a grim fact. In some parts of medieval Europe, female infanticide was disturbingly common. Families who couldn't afford more mouths to feed would sometimes accidentally smother a baby girl or leave her exposed to the cold. These weren't always malicious acts. They were desperate ones, driven by starvation, superstition, and a world that didn't see women as particularly necessary. And it wasn't just survival that was against you, it was the entire cultural structure. You were born into a world shaped by a very specific religious interpretation that said Eve messed up everything. And because of that one mythic apple bite, you're now cursed to suffer. In childbirth, in silence, in obedience, your entire existence is a kind of penance for a sin you didn't commit. Now here's something odd. One quirky detail in the grim greyness of it all. In some parts of medieval France, people believed that if a pregnant woman looked at something ugly, her baby would turn out hideous. So women were sometimes forbidden from looking at unsightly things, which is rich considering the general state of hygiene and dental care at the time. But even with all this bleakness, historians don't entirely agree on just how hopeless life was for women. There's ongoing debate about whether some women, especially in certain regions or time periods, had more autonomy than we assume. For example, some records show women involved in business, running estates, or even working as scribes and healers. but whether those were exceptions or common practice, that's still up for grabs in the academic world. For now, though, your baby eyes blink up at the cracked rafters overhead, and the future looms like a storm cloud. You have no idea what's ahead of you, how fast childhood will end, how soon you'll be told to hush and kneel, how often you'll ache or bleed or be blamed for things you didn't do. All you know is that you're here, you're small, and you're already a burden. Welcome to the Middle Ages. You're 5 now and nobody calls you a baby anymore. There's no such thing as early childhood here, just smaller chores. You're still small, still squishy in places, but you've already been taught to keep your hands busy and your mouth shut. Your mother, if she's still alive, has drilled it into you. When you're seen, be sweet. When you're not seen, be sent. That's how girls survive. You don't have toys, you don't even know what a toy is. You've got rocks and sticks and maybe a rag doll stuffed with straw if your family has time for sentiment. Mostly, you've got work. You help gather kindling. You feed chickens or goats, if your family's got any. You fetch water in a sloshing wooden bucket half your size and try not to fall in the mud. Your hands are already calloused, and your fingernails haven't been cleaned since the day you were born. Your teeth hurt sometimes, and your stomach always feels about half full, but that's just how it is. Food is simple and repetitive. Coarse bread, watery stew, maybe a turnip or two. You've heard of honey once, from an older child who claims to have tasted it. Sounds like magic. Then one day, without much warning, your body changes. You notice it first when you stand up too fast and the world tilts. Your chest is tender. Your belly aches off and on. Your mother, once distant and overworked, suddenly starts watching you more closely. She checks the straw where you sleep. She murmurs prayers at you when she thinks you're not listening. You've started to become what they call a woman, and that's not something to celebrate. Because girlhood doesn't slowly melt into adulthood. It drops off a cliff. One minute you're chasing chickens barefoot, the next you're being told to cover your hair and stop climbing trees. You're warned against talking to boys, then reminded your only job is to marry one. You're told to be pure, modest, humble, and also charming, but not too charming, or they'll think you're inviting sin. Your village is small, and gossip swirls like chimney smoke. People start whispering about your body. A neighbour's son stares too long, and suddenly you're the problem. Someone accuses you of being too grown for your age, even though you didn't exactly schedule your first period. Everyone else is allowed to change. Boys become men become landowners, but girls like you become something else. Valuable, vulnerable, and expendable all at once. Let's say you're noble. That might sound fancier, but puberty just hits harder. You're bathed more regularly, yes, but that's only because your cleanliness reflects on your family's reputation. You're scolded if you eat too much. You're watched constantly. Your father's steward notes your height, your skin, your health, not because he cares, but because all of it factors into your marriage potential. You're no longer a person, you're a package, a future alliance, a walking dowry. And speaking of dowries, here's the historical fact of the day. In medieval Europe, dowries weren't just polite gifts. They were the bribe a woman's family paid to make her someone else's problem. Your parents might have to sell land, livestock, or even indenture a sibling to afford yours, and if they couldn't, well, good luck. You might get sent to a convent or married to someone double your age with no social standing but a willingness to accept a bargain bride. Meanwhile, as you grow, no one really explains what's happening inside your body. There's no school, no pamphlet, no quiet mother-daughter talk with warm cocoa, just superstition and fear. You hear that bleeding every month is punishment for Eve's sin. You hear that if your blood touches a crop, it'll die. Some old woman whispers that touching a cow while menstruating will sour its milk. And even though part of you knows this is ridiculous, it's hard not to internalise it when everyone around you nods in solemn agreement. Want a weird detail? In parts of Germany and England, people believed menstruating women could dull knives just by looking at them. Like your period could literally take the edge off a blade. You imagine staring angrily at the hay-cutting knife to test it. But you're smart enough to never say that out loud. Even in households with more resources, education is rare. If your family is wealthy or religious, you might be taught to read, but only enough to get through the Bible. Latin? Off limits. Math? Why would you need that? Your mind is seen as a danger, a temptation, a vessel for sin. You're warned not to read too much or think too hard, thinking women are unnatural, thinking women ask questions, thinking women end up burned. Some scholars argue that childhood wasn't as bleak for medieval girls as we think. The girls played, sang, and had real friendships. There are stories from old village records describing children dancing in fields or sneaking apples from orchards, and maybe that's true in flashes. Maybe you laugh sometimes. Maybe you tell jokes behind the woodshed and dare your friends to step inside the creepy part of the churchyard. Maybe you even have a moment of joy when someone gives you a bright ribbon or a sweet crumb. But those moments are fleeting, because joy isn't something you're taught to expect. It's something that sneaks in by accident, like sunlight through a crack in the thatch. And then one day, someone arrives. Maybe a messenger, maybe a distant cousin, maybe a priest, but their words chill your mother's face and make your father rub his temples. You hear them say something about timing and fertility and a strong back, and just like that, your name is being tied to someone else's. You're not even 12 yet. This is it. Girlhood is over. Not because you grew up, but because someone else decided it was time. So here we are. You're not even through your awkward stage, and already you're betrothed. No dating, no slow burn romance, no letters with pressed flowers, just a father shaking hands with another man over ale, agreeing to hand you off like a goat or sack of grain. Maybe you met your future husband once, maybe not, doesn't really matter. You're a girl and girls don't get a vote. The betrothal contract is binding and in some places is recognised as legit marriage already. All it takes is a handshake, a priest's nod, or two people saying yes to each other in front of a witness. If your new husband is generous, he'll wait until you're about 14 before he expects anything beyond awkward dinners. If he's not, well, the church isn't thrilled about consummating a union before puberty, but local lords, not exactly known for their restraint. Let's be honest, you're a child, and marriage is just a fancier word for ownership. Your dowry is paid, your fate sealed. Whether you're noble or peasant, the story's the same, just with different outfits. If you're a farm girl, you're moving into a smoky thatch roof cottage with a man who smells like sweat, soil, and maybe fermented cabbage. If you're noble, you're off to a drafty stone hall where your husband smells like wine, old wool, and that one bath he took in March. And what about the wedding itself? Not the fairy tale gown and sparkly nonsense modern culture sells. No. Your wedding dress is probably your nicest shift. Maybe with a borrowed necklace or sprig of herbs pinned to your hair. You might wear red or blue, since white isn't really a thing yet. The feast afterward, if there is one, features lots of bread, greasy meat, and drunk uncles trying to grab your elbow. Fun! Now comes the part no one wants to say out loud. On your wedding night, you're expected to prove your virginity. That means bleeding. That means a sheet. That means witnesses, sometimes literal ones, who wait outside to see proof of your intact, obedient body. No pressure. Here's the historical fact. In some medieval households, especially in parts of southern Europe, the wedding bed was publicly blessed. A priest would literally stand at the foot of the bed, mutter prayers and sprinkle holy water before the couple was left alone to, well, complete the transaction. And if the bride didn't bleed, cue the accusations. Maybe you're not pure, maybe you're a witch, maybe you're just unlucky. Either way, your reputation hangs by a very literal thread. Let's talk about the husband. He's probably older, 10, maybe 20 years. If you're lucky, he's just indifferent. If you're not, he's controlling, cruel, or violent. And guess what? There's no hotline to call, no safe house. Marital rape isn't even a concept because the law says once you're married, your husband owns your body. Legally, morally, spiritually, you have no recourse, no rights, and definitely no support group. Here's something weird and grimly funny. In 13th century France, there was a legal debate over whether a man could beat his wife moderately. Like they had to define what kind of stick was acceptable. Too thick? That's abuse. Slender rod? That's just discipline. Moderate pain was totally fine. You could be corrected like a misbehaving ox or dog. And don't even think about leaving. Divorce is off the table unless you're rich, connected, and the Pope owes your family a favour. For everyone else, your only option is a convent, which you might get to after decades of petitioning, or death, which frankly arrives sooner than you'd like. Meanwhile, your body is not yours. It's a vessel. Your job now is to produce heirs, not children. Heirs, preferably male. You'll probably be pregnant by the time your voice stops squeaking. And if the baby isn't a boy, that's your fault somehow, even though no one understands how biology actually works. There's the myth widely believed at the time that a woman's emotions during sex determine the baby's sex. If you were cold or resentful, the baby would be female. If you were passionate, it would be a boy. No pressure. Just make sure your forced wedding night is an enthusiastic romp, or you'll get blamed for birthing girls. And when the baby does come, if it survives, you're expected to bounce back immediately. No rest, no time off. The baby cries, and you nurse it with sore breasts and cracked skin while still bleeding out from childbirth. No painkillers, no help. Maybe a midwife who smells like mead and garlic, maybe not. Some scholars argue that medieval marriage wasn't always horrific. There are letters from husbands to wives that show tenderness, even love. Some couples genuinely liked each other. Some marriages were partnerships in business and home. But it's hard to untangle those rare exceptions from the overwhelming norm. A system where love was irrelevant and obedience was mandatory. And remember, if you die in childbirth, which is extremely common, you'll be buried quickly without ceremony, while your husband looks around for wife number 2. You're replaceable. Your tombstone might say faithful wife or good mother, but it won't tell anyone your name unless you are wealthy enough to matter. So here you are, a wife, a child, a womb in a borrowed dress. You know how to curtsy, how to hold your tongue, how to keep your eyes lowered. You also know that nothing about this feels right, but you don't have the words to say it, not out loud, not in your head. There's no space for what if, just what is. And that, unfortunately, is marriage in the Middle Ages. A lifetime contract signed in silence, sanctioned by a god who always seems to side with men. So now you're married, technically, legally, spiritually, and no one cares that you're still figuring out how to braid your own hair without getting your fingers tangled. That doesn't matter. You belong to someone now. A man, of course, probably one with bad knees, a short temper, and a preference for meals hot and wives quiet. And if you thought this would feel like a chapter turning, think again. It's not a new beginning. It's a sentence, no parole. Romantic love? Please. No one marries for that unless they're very poor, very lucky, or very doomed. Love is considered suspicious in a marriage. It distracts from duty, makes you weak. All those fluttery feelings, best left to courtly poems and bored noble women sighing at minstrels from behind heavy drapes. Real marriage is about land, legacy, and locking in alliances. You're expected to be cheerful about this, or at the very least quiet about your misery. At home, you serve. That's your job now. Your husband may oversee things, but you run them. You manage the servants, cook, clean, churn, sew, teach the children, tend the fire, patch the roof, brew the ale, spin the wool, mend the clothes, and still get blamed when something goes wrong. Your title might be Lady of the House, but you're just the unpaid CEO of domestic affairs. And unlike modern bosses, you don't get a salary, or weekends, or rest, and that's if you're lucky enough to stay home. If you're a peasant wife, your work starts at dawn and doesn't end until the stars are out. You're in the field with your husband, planting barley, hoeing turnips, shoveling dung, then you come inside to make bread, sweep ashes, and bathe the baby in cold water that smells like iron. You're never clean, you're never alone, and your back always hurts. Sex? Still not up to you? You don't say no, not because you don't want to, but because the concept of consent doesn't exist for you. You're your husband's property now. He can't rape you, legally speaking, because the law says he owns your body the way he owns his ox. If you're bruised afterward, too bad. If you cry, who's listening? Here's the fact of the night. Medieval church doctrine taught that sex, even within marriage, was shameful unless it was purely for procreation. Enjoying it too much was a sin. So imagine the twisted double standard you live under. You're expected to be sexually available, but not sexual. Passionate? You're a whore. Cold? You're frigid and disobedient. There's no winning here, just different ways to lose. And speaking of losing, every time you miss a period, your heart sinks. Not because you're excited, but because you know what comes next. Another pregnancy, another round of nausea, swelling, headaches, back pain, and terrifying uncertainty. You could die. The baby could die. You both could die. And yet it keeps happening, year after year, because that's what your body is for, making more people no matter the cost. Now here's a weird little fact. In some parts of medieval Europe, people believed that tying a frog to your thigh would help with fertility. And if that doesn't sound charming enough, they sometimes buried the frog afterward under your bed to trap the baby spirits. Bizarre, slimy ritual that somehow made sense in a world where medicine and magic were basically the same thing. The scholarly debate, though, that comes in here. Historians disagree about how miserable medieval married life actually was for women. Some argue that medieval women had more control within the home than we think, that they had influence, respect, and even affection from their husbands. Others say that's pure fantasy, propped up by a few cherry-picked examples of noble women and merchant wives who lucked into decent marriages. For most women, the daily reality was endless work, no autonomy, and the constant looming threat of death, by childbirth, disease, or someone else's rage. Let's talk about rage. Your husband is having a bad day. Maybe a deal fell through. Maybe someone mocked him at the tavern. You come in at the wrong moment, maybe holding the wrong thing, maybe speaking too loud or too soft or too early. His fist meets your face. No one stops him. No one says a word. You are his property, and discipline is his right. The bruises fade, but the silence lasts forever. But don't think that your suffering earns you sainthood. No one praises your strength. No one calls you a warrior. They call you weak, emotional, hysterical. You're blamed for sin, blamed for war, blamed for anything that goes wrong in a man's life. Medieval theology insists you are the daughter of Eve, born to deceive, tempt and betray. A beautiful trap best kept barefoot, obedient and humble. Your church tells you that marriage is your salvation, but it feels like a punishment. The priest talks about sacred union, while you grit your teeth through another night of duty. They say the man is the head of the house and you are the heart, but your heart doesn't get a say. It just beats in time with the chores, the crying, the cold. Sometimes you wonder what it would be like to run, to leave your cottage or hall and disappear into the woods, live like a witch or a widow, alone and free. But even that isn't safe. A woman alone is suspicious. A woman without a husband is either a prostitute, a heretic, or both. No man's property. That means you must belong to the devil. So you stay, you endure, you smile when you need to, you cry into the hearth smoke, you teach your daughter what you were taught. Keep your voice low, your head down, your prayers frequent, and your body modest. Because love won't save you, kindness won't save you, only survival might. And you think, just for a moment, about what it would be like if things were different. If you were born a boy, or born later, or born into a world that didn't grind you down from the minute you arrived. But then the baby cries again, the soup is boiling over, and your husband yells your name like a command. Daydreams can't help you. Not here, not now. Virginity. You're taught it's your greatest asset, the most sacred, mysterious, and totally not creepy thing about you. Before marriage, it defines your value. After marriage, it's just no longer relevant. Except when men use it to compare you to every other woman who still has hers, you're either a treasure or trash based on whether your hymen, a body part most of them don't even understand, performed its bloody magic trick on demand. It starts early. People start talking about your purity before you even know what it means. You're warned not to talk to boys, not to dance, not to laugh too loudly in public, because all of that might make someone think you're impure. You don't own your body, you curate it like a display case. Keep it wrapped, covered, untouched. It's not about your comfort, ever. It's about how men perceive you. Your purity exists for them. And here's the thing, no one really agrees on what virginity is. Even then, some say it's physical, an intact hymen. Others say it's spiritual, a certain aura of obedience and modesty. Still others believe it can be lost just by thinking the wrong thoughts or looking too long at the wrong man. It's a moving target, always ready to trip you up. You could be married off as a child forced into sex and still be blamed for not being pure enough. The wedding night blood test? Not optional. For many families, that sheet is your proof of worth. If it comes out clean, you're in trouble. If it comes out too bloody, they whisper about curses or strange behaviour. Either way, you're on trial. And heaven forbid you have any medical condition, like, say, not bleeding during first-time intercourse. Because guess what? You might get sent back to your parents, or worse. Here's tonight's grim, historical gem. In some regions of medieval Spain and France, entire families would gather outside the bridal chamber, cheering or jeering based on what they saw, or didn't see, on the stained bedsheet waved like a grotesque flag of honour. In some noble households, a servant was even designated to confirm consummation. And if the husband wasn't satisfied, he could declare the marriage invalid, all because of a fluid. This obsession with virginity goes beyond superstition. It becomes legal. In some parts of medieval Europe, laws protected men from marrying women who weren't virgins, even if those men had been, shall we say, less than chaste themselves. In Italy, certain city-states actually had legal trials over broken betrothals based on the alleged virginity, or lack thereof, of the bride. Evidence? Often hearsay, body-shaming, or random gossip. Science? Nowhere in sight. But let's talk about the science they did believe. Here's the quirky fact of the night. Some medieval physicians thought the uterus had teeth, literal teeth. There were stories of it biting during intercourse, devouring sperm, or even attacking wandering hands. Scholars thought this explained women who were unwilling to be touched. No, Brenda, it's not trauma. It's your demonic dental womb. And if the obsession with virginity wasn't enough, you also had to live with the constant reminders that your body was dangerous. You, the walking temptation. You, the root of all sin. Monks filled entire manuscripts with sermons about the perilous beauty of women, how your face could lead a man to hell faster than a battlefield or bottle of mead. Some even claimed that just looking at a woman could imperil a man's soul. No pressure. But wait, it gets worse. Women were considered more lustful than men. Yep, that was the thinking, that you were naturally more driven by carnal desire and therefore more sinful. Your body, even untouched, was a loaded weapon. If a man fell into temptation, your fault. If a priest had impure thoughts, you probably walked by too provocatively. If someone committed a crime of passion, you must have bewitched them, even if you were the victim. That brings us to a really hard truth. Sexual assault wasn't just common, it was normalised. If a man attacked a woman, the law often considered whether she screamed loud enough, fought hard enough, had enough witnesses, or, wait for it, was a virgin at the time. Virgin victims were taken slightly more seriously. Non-virgins? Well, you probably wanted it, or deserved it, or tempted him. The default assumption was guilt. Yours. And if the attacker was your husband, that wasn't even considered a crime. Marriage erased your right to refuse. It wasn't about desire. It was about control. If your husband wanted sex, you were expected to oblige, no matter your health, mood, or emotional state. Saying no wasn't disobedient to Bashis. It was illegal. But there's a flicker of resistance barely visible, like a candle flickering in a damp corridor. Some women do speak out. Some write letters, poems, or prayers that quietly rage against the injustice. Some tell stories of love that defies social order, or record their own experiences in secret. But most go unheard, or their voices are filtered through male scribes who adjust the tone for public consumption. Scholars still argue over whether this cultural obsession with virginity was as intense for all classes. Maybe peasant girls weren't held to the same impossible standards as noble women. Maybe in rural areas, people were more focused on whether you could carry water and bake bread than whether your sheets came out red on the first night. But even then you weren't free, just judged differently. And here's the cruelest part of all. Even if you do everything right, stay pure, marry properly, bear children, you're still disposable. Your virginity is a ticket to respectability, not protection. If your husband dies or falls into debt or simply decides he wants someone younger, your history doesn't save you. You're just another woman in the crowd, another body in the church, another story no one bothers to remember. So yeah, virginity. It's a trap. A social cage wrapped in ribbons and incense. A performance you're required to give with no script, no training, and no control over the final scene. You're a few years into marriage now, and you're already starting to feel older than your years. Your hips ache, your feet crack, and your hands are always rough, no matter how many herbs you rub into them at night. You've had one, maybe two babies, probably more if your body cooperated, and with each birth you come closer to dying. But that's not how anyone around you sees it. They smile when you're round with child. They pray for a boy, they bless your womb like it's an altar. You just try to survive it. Pregnancy is not glowing or radiant or cute. It's terrifying. Your belly grows like a countdown clock, and everyone has opinions about what it means. Old women rub your shoulders and guess the baby's sex based on the shape of your stomach. Your mother-in-law tells you to avoid eels and look only at beautiful things so your baby doesn't come out cursed. You do what you're told, partly because you don't know any better, but mostly because you're scared. You've seen too many women vanish after childbirth. One day they're waddling down the lane, the next their names are whispered in church between coughs and murmurs. There's no doctor, no epidural, no sterile environment. When labour starts, you hope someone sends for the midwife in time. She's not a licensed professional, there's no such thing. She's a local woman who's seen more births than anyone else. She carries a bag full of cloth, herbs, maybe a little wine if you're lucky. She knows how to cut the cord with a sharpened reed, and she can tell when the baby's in the wrong position. But if things go bad, if your bleeding won't stop or the baby doesn't cry, there's nothing she can do except pray. Here's your historical fact. In medieval England, it was common practice for women in labour to confess their sins out loud during childbirth, in case they died before the baby came out. The line between birth and death was so thin it was basically a spiritual emergency. Some priests even stood outside the birthing room ready to perform last rites through a door if needed. Imagine pushing a baby out while also preparing your soul for eternity. And of course, once the child is born, it's not like you get to rest. You might get a day, maybe two, before someone hands you laundry to scrub or tells you to check the root cellar for mouldy grain. Your baby sleeps in a wooden cradle near the hearth, and you nurse it between chores, holding it in one arm while kneading bread with the other. If the baby cries too much, people whisper about spirits or the evil eye. If it doesn't cry at all, you hold your breath, because silence can be worse. The worst part, most of your children won't make it. Infant mortality is brutal. Fevers, infections, the cold, bad water, a careless moment when someone leaves the fire uncovered. You name your children knowing the odds, maybe even name 2 in a row the same thing, hoping one of them survives. The death of a baby isn't rare, it's expected, but that doesn't mean it hurts less. You hear other women say things like, God wanted him, or at least we still have the others. You nod and smile because you're supposed to, but inside you feel like a piece of you has been scooped out and left to rot in the field. You still wake up at night, listening for crying that never comes. You still look at the empty cradle and catch yourself planning meals for a mouth that isn't there. And even when your children survive, you're constantly trying to keep them alive. You nurse them until your breasts sag and ache. You make pottage with whatever scraps you can find. You protect them from strange animals, illnesses, sudden weather. You teach your daughters to be quiet and your sons to pray. You don't want to, but you have to. You know what the world does to noisy girls. Here's something odd and kind of depressing. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, parents sometimes waited weeks before naming a baby. Why? Because the chances of the child dying were so high they didn't want to get attached too soon. Babies were called by placeholder terms, little one, the boy, my heart, until they passed what was basically a probation period for staying alive. Now let's talk about the church again, because, surprise, they have opinions about your motherhood too. They say childbirth is your punishment for Eve's sin. That pain is necessary. That suffering makes you holier. You're not supposed to scream or cry too loud during labour. You're meant to bear it with grace. If you scream too much, they say it's because you've lived improperly, or you're possessed, or you weren't chaste enough. Imagine being told your agony is your own fault while you're actively tearing open in a smokily wooden shack. And then, of course, there's the religious guilt about your own body. Should you enjoy breastfeeding? No, that's vanity. Should you feel proud of surviving birth? No, that's arrogance. Every part of motherhood is framed as a humble, invisible service. No one writes poems about it. No one sings songs about it. The mother is the background figure. There, always, but never celebrated. Unless she dies. Then they'll write her name in the church records and call her faithful and good. Historians debate whether motherhood gave women power in the home. Some argue that a mother with many children gained status, especially if she produced sons. Others argue that this power was just another trap, glorifying women as mothers so they could be worked harder and blamed more when things went wrong. Either way, it wasn't real autonomy. It was conditional praise. You could be the perfect mother for 20 years, but if your husband fell sick or your children strayed from the church, guess who they'd blame? So you carry on. One baby on your hip, one in your belly, one buried under the elm tree. You whisper lullabies with hoarse breath and hands that won't stop trembling. You say prayers even when you're not sure who's listening. You watch your children sleep, wondering who they'll become, if they get the chance. Because deep down, you know you won't always be around. And in this world, without a mother, a girl doesn't stand much of a chance. Every morning you wake up hoping not to be pregnant, and every few months you are. Again. You've learned to tell the signs before they're obvious. The way your lower back feels like it's been grinding against rocks, the nausea that hits before the sun's even cleared the trees, the way smells become unbearable, like bread, like sweat, like everything. You never get used to it. Every pregnancy feels heavier than the last, not just in your belly, but in your bones, your breath, your sense of time, because this isn't just pregnancy, it's a gamble every single time. You're not counting the weeks to pick out a name or sew tiny booties. You're counting the weeks and hoping you'll live to see the end of them. You hope the baby won't come breech. You hope you don't hemorrhage. You hope you don't get infected. You hope the baby doesn't get stuck. And above all, you hope you're not alone when it starts. And if you think people are gentle with you during this time, think again. Pregnancy isn't sacred here. It's accepted. It's a task, a job, and failure is not tolerated. You keep working until your ankles swell and your belly scrapes the table when you bend to light the fire. You're still expected to bake, mend, harvest, and smile. If you complain, you're dramatic. If you rest too much, you're lazy. Your husband might be proud, especially if it's a boy, but he won't help. That's not how it works. Want something really terrifying? Here's your historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, women weren't allowed to make wills unless they were on their deathbed during childbirth. That's how common it was to die. The law actually had a provision called deathbed testaments, just for labouring mothers. You're lying there, sweaty, bleeding, writhing in pain, and a priest is pressing you to declare who gets your clothes, your rosary, your chickens, and if you do survive, you don't bounce back. There's no maternity leave, no chicken broth deliveries or baskets of muffins. You're up within days, sometimes within hours, tending to the household again. If you're lucky, the baby nurses well. If not, you're dealing with cracked, bleeding nipples and a screaming newborn who refuses to latch. You ask the older women for help. They tell you to drink warm beer or rub goose fat on your chest. Maybe it helps. Probably not. This is the cycle. Conceive, carry, birth. Recover, repeat. Your body barely remembers what it feels like not to be swollen or sore. Your menstrual cycle used to feel like a curse. Now it feels like a tiny window of freedom, a brief moment when you're not a walking cradle. But don't get too used to it, guys. Because if you stop getting pregnant, too early, too suddenly, people start talking. What's wrong with her? Is she cursed? Is she no longer useful? This brings us to the strange little fringe fact of the night. Medieval fertility cures were everywhere, and they were wild. One popular remedy involved crushing dried mouse bones and mixing them with wine. Another told women to sleep with a warm loaf of bread under their armpit. Something about attracting favourable spirits. And then there's the classic. Smear honey and goat dung on your thighs, chant a psalm and wait. Sure, that'll do it. But here's the darker side. If you don't conceive when expected, suspicion sets in. Maybe you're barren, maybe you're cursed, or maybe you're using forbidden means to avoid pregnancy, which is a big no-no in the church's eyes. Contraception isn't just frowned upon, it's outright sinful. That includes everything from herbal tonics to simple timing tricks. If someone suspects you're preventing pregnancy on purpose, that's witch territory. You're suddenly not just a wife, you're a threat to the natural order. Scholars still argue about how common birth control really was in the Middle Ages. Some suggest that women shared herbal knowledge in secret, things like pennyroyal, wild carrot or silphium, which famously went extinct, possibly because it was too popular. Others believe that most women didn't have access to such information, or were too afraid to try it. Because if you were caught, that wasn't just sinful, it was criminal. You could be punished by the church, or worse, punished by your husband. And speaking of punishment, miscarriage is another risk, one that's equal parts heartbreaking and dangerous. If you lose a child, you bleed, sometimes for days, and the midwife tells you to stay in bed, to drink bone broth, to pray, but in the back of your mind, whoa, you know what people are thinking. Did she do something wrong? Did she anger God? Did she eat the wrong route or walk too far or think too dark a thought? It's not enough to grieve. You have to defend yourself while you do it. Meanwhile, your older children still need food, your husband still wants attention, the chickens still need chasing, and your body is still breaking. You try to keep your head clear, but you forget words now. You cry more easily. Sometimes your hands shake when you're sewing. You wonder if it's normal. The midwife says it's just exhaustion. The priest says maybe you're harbouring sin. No one says, maybe you're traumatized. That word doesn't exist here. What you're feeling isn't named. It's ignored. And worst of all, you're not even special. Everyone you know is going through the same thing. Your neighbours, your sisters, your friends. You hear the screams from other homes, the wails of mourning, the sharp silence after a stillbirth. No one talks about it directly. They just nod when you meet their eyes, tighten their shawls and carry on. Because what else can you do? There's no birth certificate, no baby shower, no celebration. If the child lives, you get a baptism. If not, you bury it quietly and move on, because you have to. Because you're expected to. Because if you don't, people will call you selfish or strange or unstable. And yet even in all this mess, this endless cycle of fear and pain and loss, you love your children. Of course you do. That's what makes it worse. You look at their small faces and realise how much you'd give to protect them. You'd endure this 10 times over, 100, because in a world that sees you as nothing more than a vessel, they're the only thing that feels like yours. Even if you know, deep down, they never really will be. The baby survived. That's the good news. He's loud, pink, healthy, strong lungs, wide eyes, already grabbing at your hair like it owns it. Which, to be fair, he kind of does. The bad news? You've already buried 2 others before him, so now you love this one with the kind of anxious desperation that keeps you up long after he's fallen asleep. You watch his chest rise and fall in the cradle and pray, fiercely, silently, that he stays breathing. You'd think motherhood might earn you some peace, but no. It earns you more expectations, more judgment, more pressure. The moment you become a mother, you're supposed to stop existing outside that role. People don't ask how you're doing. They ask how the baby is, if he's eating, if he's quiet, if he's a good boy, a good one. Your health, your sleep, your mental state, not exactly top priorities. And as the child grows, so does the labour. Raising children in the Middle Ages isn't just about teaching them to read psalms or memorise saints. It's about keeping them alive in a world that seems intent on swallowing them whole. You teach them to avoid the well when it's muddy, to stay away from strange men, to never eat berries they find in the woods unless you say it's okay. You teach them about danger with your voice, your eyes, your every muscle always coiled for reaction. Then there's discipline. You're expected to correct your children the way you'd correct a goat or a dog. Physical punishment is considered not just normal, but moral. A whipping for disobedience? That's love. A slap for lying? That's justice. Even when it makes your stomach turn, you do it. Because if you don't, someone else will, and they'll do it harder. Better your hand than a stranger's cane. But discipline isn't just about the body, it's about the soul. The church makes sure of that. You're told your child is born in sin, that every selfish impulse is a stain on their soul and it's your job to scrub it clean. If your child misbehaves, it's a reflection on you. So you scold, you pray, you cry quietly after they've gone to bed. And you wonder if this guilt is what your own mother felt too. Here's your historical fact for the night. In many medieval homes, children were seen as little adults. They wore miniature versions of adult clothes, worked in the fields as soon as they could carry a basket, and were held morally responsible for their actions by the age of 7. Childhood wasn't a sanctuary. It was a short hallway to responsibility, and women were expected to push their kids through it as quickly as possible. And if you're a mother of a daughter, that's a whole other nightmare. Because while sons are supposed to grow into strong, God-fearing men, daughters are supposed to grow into marriageable, obedient women. Sound familiar? You see yourself in her, the way she lowers her eyes, the way she chews her sleeve when she's nervous, the way she glances toward the horizon, like she might one day walk out there and not come back. You try to teach her what you know, how to carry herself, how to stay quiet without looking scared, how to keep her head covered when she's bleeding so the neighbours don't start whispering. You want to protect her, but the only tools you have are the same ones that were used to control you. You start to wonder if teaching her to survive this system is just another way of teaching her to submit to it. Now here's a weird little fact. In some parts of Europe it was considered lucky to rub a newborn with butter. Not as a treatment, just for general good fortune. Some families did it regularly, believing it would help the baby grow fat and happy. Butter babies, soft, slippery, and probably a magnet for every stray cat in the village. But even with those odd superstitions, there's no illusion of safety. Your child can die from a fever, from a bad turnip, from stepping on a rusty nail. Disease is constant. Plague, dysentery, smallpox, worms. It's an alphabet of doom. There's no vaccine, no medicine that actually works. You try herbal teas, poultices, sometimes a prayer or relic pressed to their forehead. But when the fever spikes, there's only waiting. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And if the child dies, you mourn in silence. You might tear your hair or wail, depending on local customs, but eventually you're expected to shut it down. Grief, like everything else, has rules. You wash the body, you sew the shroud, you say the prayers. You carry on, because you have no choice. The chickens still need feeding, the younger ones still need bathing. Life absurdly keeps moving. Scholars have long debated whether medieval women were emotionally distant from their children, given the high infant mortality rate. Some argue that women couldn't afford to get too attached. Others say that's nonsense. Of course they grieved, but they had to grieve efficiently. Crying for months doesn't fill the woodpile. Sobbing doesn't cook dinner. So they learn to grieve while stirring stew or sweeping ashes, mourning between tasks, their sorrow woven into every stitch. And what about your marriage during all this? Not exactly thriving. Your husband sees you more as a function now than a partner, if he ever saw you as one to begin with. You're the one who runs the household, raises the kids, tends the sick. You might share a bed, but you rarely share words. When he wants you, he takes you. When he doesn't, he drinks. Sometimes you dream about leaving, just picking up a cloak and slipping into the woods like one of those women in old stories. The ones who live in caves or forest huts and talk to animals and don't answer to anyone. But you know that kind of freedom doesn't really exist, not for women, and definitely not for mothers. A woman alone is a danger. A mother alone is an abomination. So instead, you keep going. You bury your babies. You feed the ones who survive. You try not to think too hard about the future because it looks a lot like the past. But in quiet moments, when the fire's low, when the children are finally asleep, you let your mind wander. What if it could be different? What if she, your daughter, didn't have to do this? You won't say it aloud, but you think it. And in this world, sometimes that's the only kind of rebellion you get. It's early morning and you're already tired. Your feet hit the dirt floor before the rooster crows, and your first thought isn't about sunrise or breakfast, it's about surviving the day without crying in front of anyone. The work never ends. You scrape ashes out of the hearth with hands that no longer feel the difference between warmth and burns. You sweep with a broom that sheds more than it collects. You knead dough until your wrists ache and haul water from the well like your spine's made of wood. No one thanks you, no one notices, but if something isn't done, everyone complains. Whether you're peasant or noble, the truth doesn't change. Being a woman means working constantly, and usually without pay, credit, or the right to say no. You're expected to handle every domestic chore, every family crisis, every moment of quiet suffering, with the poise of a saint and the efficiency of a hired hand, except you're not hired. You're owned. Your workday isn't measured by hours, it's measured by muscle memory. Wash, sweep, feed, sew, mend, repeat. Your body knows when to wake up, when to bow, when to stop talking. No one keeps track of what you do, and no one thinks of it as work, not really. You're not producing goods, you're producing comfort, stability, cleanliness, meals, and these are considered your natural duties, not something that deserves compensation. Here's the historical fact of the night. Under medieval feudal law, most women couldn't own land. A small number of widows and unmarried women could manage estates temporarily, but even then, it was considered a stopgap until a proper male heir could be found. So you can plough the field, plant the seed, harvest the crop, and still not own a single turnip of it. And don't assume noble women have it easier. Sure, they're not hauling buckets or gutting fish, but they're still managing vast households, overseeing dozens of servants, handling the bookkeeping because yes, someone has to count those grain stores, and arranging marriages for their children before they've even lost their baby teeth. If they're married to a lord who's off at war or on pilgrimage, they might run an entire estate in his absence, but still they can't own it. If he dies, the property goes to his brother, his son, his cousin, his dog, anyone but the woman who kept it afloat. And don't even try to open a shop unless you're a widow. In some cities, widows could inherit their husband's business, temporarily. But even then, it had to be feminine work: weaving, baking, brewing, midwifery. If you wanted to cobble shoes or carve wood or repair tools, people raised their eyebrows. A woman in a man's trade? That's not just unseemly, it's threatening. And if you happen to be good at it, that's worse. Now you're unnatural. Of course, some women did the work anyway. They ran inns, traded goods, and even taught apprentices in secret. But they had to fight for every scrap of legitimacy. You could be working the forge beside your husband for 20 years, but when he dies, the guild won't recognise you, because you're not a real blacksmith. You're just a woman who got lucky with a hammer. Here's your quirky historical footnote. In some parts of medieval Germany, beer brewing was actually considered women's mean work. They called them alewives, and they were respitted until they became too successful. Then they were accused of watering down their brew, cheating customers, or, being witches, because apparently making good beer as a woman was fine, unless you made money at it. And what happens when a woman demands payment? Let's say a noblewoman does the accounting for an entire estate while her husband's away. Or a townswoman works in a bakery and wants a wage equal to her male co-workers. People scoff. Why does she need money? Her husband provides. As if you don't deserve to own the fruits of your own labour. As if needing something disqualifies you from earning it. There are no pensions, no retirement. You work until your body gives out, and even then they might still expect you to mend clothes or watch the younger children. If you're old and childless, you're a burden. If you're old and widowed, you might end up begging at the church door. The men get remembered as elders, scribes, leaders. You get remembered, if at all, as someone's mother, someone's wife, someone who helped out. And yet the entire system, this big, groaning machine of medieval life, would collapse without you. Without women baking, farming, nursing, managing, instructing, stitching and stretching themselves thin across every need, everything would fall apart. But do you get a statue, a record, a name in a dusty manuscript? Nope. That's the part that stings the most. You work yourself raw, hold your family together through hunger and death and war, and when you die they carve beloved wife on your headstone, if they even bother with a headstone. Scholars argue over how many rights women really had in daily labour. Some point to documents showing female scribes, merchants and innkeepers. Others say those were anomalies, rare exceptions in a system built to keep women silent and subservient. And even if you could work openly, you still had to navigate gossip, jealousy and religious scrutiny. You could be the most industrious woman in the village, but if someone doesn't like how you walk or speak or dress, they might accuse you of being too proud. A woman who works too hard? Suspicious. A woman who doesn't work at all? Lazy. It's a trap either way. So you do what you always do. You carry the basket, you bake the bread, you hold the system up with your calloused hands and keep your head down. Because when you're a woman in the Middle Ages, survival isn't just about food or shelter. It's about playing a role so well, they forget it was forced on you. You're bleeding, again, but this time it's not childbirth. It's just your monthly curse, returned to remind you that you're still a woman, still a sinner, still a walking mess of flesh and shame. There's no calendar to track it, no heating pad, no corner store with chocolate and ibuprofen. You just feel it creeping up like a storm in your bones. The cramps, the mood swings, the swelling, the sense of being vaguely cursed by the moon at Holf. There's no real word for period in polite medieval conversation. The whole thing is shrouded in euphemism. The time of the flowers, the woman's curse, unclean days. You don't talk about it openly, except maybe in whispers to other women when the pain's too sharp or the flow too heavy. Even then you speak quietly. There are beliefs about this blood, bad ones, that it poisons crops, that it turns wine sour, that it drives dogs mad. You're expected to keep it discreet, always. No leaks, no stains, no signs. Not that you've got many tools to work with. There are no pads or tampons, maybe a folded scrap of cloth, maybe some moss if you're desperate. You learn to walk carefully, sit with caution, and carry that silent fear that someone might notice. And if they do, the look they give you isn't sympathy, it's disgust. Let's hit the historical fact early tonight. Medieval medical texts claimed menstruation was a way for women to purge excess humours, bad blood basically. The idea was that your body, being naturally colder and wetter, yes, those were the official adjectives for women, had to expel this build-up regularly. Otherwise, your uterus might start wandering around your body in search of something to do. Yes, a wandering womb. That was a legitimate diagnosis, one that explained everything from headaches to fainting spells to unusual behaviour. You're not tired, you're just uterus-possessed. The wandering womb theory is ridiculous, sure, but the implications were deadly serious. It fed into a long tradition of viewing women's bodies as unstable, dangerous, and emotionally contagious. If you cried, it was your womb. If you argued, your humours were imbalanced. If you dared to get angry in public, better check for uterine ghosts. Menstruation wasn't just a biological function, it was evidence of your inferiority. And during this time of the month you were religiously unclean. Some churches barred women from taking communion while menstruating. Others outright banned them from stepping inside during their cycle. You, the life-giver, were considered spiritually toxic for a few days each month. You could serve the Lord in every other way. Sing hymns, birth children, kneel in prayer, but not while bleeding. That made you untouchable. At home, it didn't get much better. There was no special treatment, no break from work. You bled while baking, while carrying wood, while grinding grain with your whole body. You bled while nursing, while mourning, while dragging your aching frame through a field at dawn. The pain wasn't an excuse, it was just background noise. Everyone expected you to keep moving, and you did, because stopping wasn't an option. Even among other women, there's a strange silence around it. You'd think it might be a point of shared understanding, a moment of solidarity, but the shame runs deep, buried under layers of religious fear, bad medicine, and cultural disgust. So you don't talk, you just endure it in silence, like every other woman around you. Now for the fringe fact, did you know that in parts of medieval France and Italy, people believed a menstruating woman's gaze could wither crops or kill bees? Not her touch, not her breath, her gaze. You could ruin a harvest just by looking at it too long while bleeding. And if you were accused of this kind of supernatural sabotage, you might be subject to a public shaming or a cleansing ritual. That's right, all for the crime of having a functional uterus. There's a certain bitter humour in it, really. The same society that demands you produce children as proof of your worth is also horrified by the process that makes that possible. You're praised for fertility, but shamed for the mechanism that enables it. Your bleeding is both sacred and disgusting, vital and cursed. No wonder you learn to treat your own body like an enemy. It's leaking sin. Of course, scholars argue about how universal these taboos were. Some say they were mostly church-imposed, with rural women possibly enjoying more relaxed attitudes, sharing herbal remedies, laughing off the worst of it, maybe even passing down natural wisdom about pain relief and cycles. But others say the fear and stigma were present in nearly every layer of society. Even if some women knew the bleeding was normal, they still had to hide it from men who didn't. And God help you if something goes wrong with your cycle. Too much blood, you might be dying. Not enough. Maybe you're barren. Sudden stops? That's suspicious. Are you cursed? Did you sleep with a demon? There's no real way to know, because there are no doctors who take your symptoms seriously, only men with beards and dusty books who write about your body like it's a haunted barn. And you can't read their books anyway. You rely on gossip, folklore, and the quiet counsel of older women who've seen too much and survived it all. You trust them more than the priests or healers. They give you herbs, advice, and the one thing no man ever will: acknowledgement. Maybe even empathy. You sit together over a cauldron and or in the dark corner of the kitchen, trading stories about cramping and flooding, and that one time you nearly fainted while chasing a goose uphill. They laugh. You laugh. And for a moment it's not so bad, but then the bleeding ends, and you're back to your regular schedule of cooking, praying, and dodging accusations of impropriety. Because the world doesn't pause for your pain. It barely acknowledges it exists. You've learned to live like this, silently bleeding while smiling, aching while kneading dough, dreaming of rest you'll never get. Because when you're a woman in the Middle Ages, your blood is a burden, your body a battlefield, and no one ever brings you flowers. Just more expectations. You're not feeling well, again, but this time it's different. Not the dragging exhaustion of pregnancy or the bone-deep ache of a long day. This is sharper, stranger. Your stomach twists. You feel cold and hot in waves. The back of your throat tastes like metal, but you don't stop working. You don't mention it out loud, I know, because in your world, being sick isn't unusual. It's expected. Everyone's always a little sick, a little worn down, a little closer to death than they'd like to admit. It's the Middle Ages. Illness is just part of the atmosphere. But for women, getting sick is also a moral failing. That's what they say. You must have done something wrong. Maybe you didn't pray hard enough. Maybe you ate something forbidden or stayed out in the moonlight too long. The line between illness and punishment is blurry here. No one understands how the body works, least of all the people trying to heal it. Here's the historical reality. Medieval medicine is a cocktail of herbs, superstition, and a deep misunderstanding of human anatomy. The dominant theory is about the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you're sick, it's because your humours are out of balance. Too hot, too wet, too dry, too cold. Doesn't matter if you've been poisoned or just caught a stomach bug. Someone's going to recommend bloodletting, a mustard plaster, or possibly a blessed amulet tied around your neck. Now, if you're a woman, you're considered biologically inferior in this model. You're thought to be naturally colder and moister than men, which supposedly makes you more prone to illness, irrationality, and, of course, hysteria. That's a real diagnosis. Hysteria, from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Everything from insomnia to weeping to disobedience is blamed on your uterus misbehaving. Your body isn't just flawed, it's dangerous. Let's throw in tonight's fringe fact. In some medieval texts, it's claimed that a woman's womb could move around her body like a small angry animal. It could travel up to the throat and choke you, or nestle near your heart and cause emotional fits. Treatments included herbal steam baths, burning aromatic herbs near the vagina to lure the womb back to its rightful place like a cranky cat, or applying sweet oils to your thighs while chanting prayers. Nothing about this sounds helpful. Most of it sounds like an excuse to not listen to what you're actually saying about your own pain. If you're married, your husband might call a physician, but don't expect much. Medieval doctors are educated, yes, but only in texts written by other men who never spoke to a living woman in their lives. They might prescribe leeches, dried bat powder, or a concoction involving wine, sage, and crushed snail shells. And if none of that works, time to call the priest. Because when the doctors fail, they say it's your soul. Maybe you're harbouring sin. Maybe you looked at a man too long, or envied someone's bread, or felt joy when you shouldn't have. The body and the soul are linked, and for women that link is policed by suspicion. If you're sick too often, people start wondering, are you cursed? Are you being punished? Or worse, are you a witch? Women healers are everywhere, but they're a double-edged sword. The village wise woman might know how to cure your fever with yarrow tea, or soothe cramps with mugwort. But if she cures too many people, or charges money, gets too much respect, she becomes a threat. Jealous neighbours start whispering. The church frowns, because in this era, healing without divine permission is dangerously close to heresy. And you? You might know a few tricks yourself. You've learned from older women. How to make onion poultices, how to use vinegar to clean wounds, how to boil down bones for broth thick enough to bring someone back from the brink. But you never claim to be a healer. That would be asking for trouble. You just say you're helping. Some historians argue that medieval women had more agency in health matters than we think, that they had control over their own bodies through herbal knowledge, midwifery and female-centered spaces like the birthing room. But others say that's wishful thinking, that the church and male physicians slowly pushed women out of medicine, turning once respected healers into suspects, blurring the line between midwife and witch. And when your illness gets worse, you're stuck. Hospitals exist, but they're more like hospices, places to go when you're dying, not to get better. If you're poor, you can't afford a doctor. If you're rich, you might get one, but their treatments could kill you faster. There's no anaesthesia, no antibiotics, no clean tools. A surgeon is often a barber on the side, and he's more familiar with shaving faces than saving lives. The scariest part. You start to believe them, that your body is wrong, that you were made to be weaker, that maybe you're sick because you deserve it. And in that headspace, you stop fighting. You don't complain when your fever climbs. You don't cry when you lose the ability to walk for a few days. You just wait it out, wrapped in blankets, sweat-soaked and afraid, and hope someone brings you broth before you fade completely. And if you do get better, there's no celebration. You get up, brush the straw from your skirt and return to work. No one asks how you're feeling. They're just relieved you can scrub floors again. Your brief glimpse of mortality is forgotten as quickly as last season's barley crop. You tuck the herbs away. You don't talk about the night you thought you might die. You stir the pot, fold the cloth, tend the fire. Because being sick is an inconvenience. For them. For you, it was a scream no one heard. So you carry on in a body they never bothered to understand, a body they blamed, a body they feared, a body they used. And you wonder sometimes what healing might look like in a world that actually cared. You say something, just once. Maybe it's a sharp word, a sarcastic comment, a look that lingers too long. Maybe you dare to ask why something has to be the way it is. Or maybe you speak up when a man interrupts you for the third time in one conversation. It's nothing, really, barely worth mentioning. But someone notices, and then someone else, and then suddenly your name is in people's mouths for the wrong reasons. She talks too much. She's not modest. She has ideas. Ideas are dangerous when you're a woman in the Middle Ages. Not just the big, bold ones. Even the small, sensible, practical ones. Wanting to read. Wanting to manage your household differently. Wanting to go to market alone. All of these things can mark you as difficult. And a difficult woman isn't just disliked. She's a problem that needs solving. Now maybe people just grumble about you. Maybe your neighbour won't speak to you anymore. Maybe the local priest gives you a long, loaded sermon about obedience and humility. But sometimes it goes further. Sometimes people whisper another word or witch. At first it's just a murmur. She brews things, they say. She keeps to herself. She knows when her babies are coming. You don't even need to be magical. You just need to be odd or smart or inconvenient. And then it begins, slow and smoky, like a fire that hasn't quite caught yet. Eyes following you, people crossing themselves when you pass, children told not to talk to you, and you start to feel it, like static on your skin, the turning. Here's your historical fact of the night. While the height of the European witch hunts came later, in the 15th to 17th centuries, the seeds were planted in the medieval period. Accusations of sorcery and heresy existed long before the bonfires. The church taught that women were more likely to be witches because they were considered morally weaker, easily tempted, and naturally connected to the body and the earth, both of which were viewed as suspicious. You were vulnerable, and that vulnerability was weaponized against you. And who got accused most often? Women who didn't fit the mould, widows with no male protector, healers with too much herbal knowledge, midwives who lost a baby during delivery, women who dared to say no, who were too old, too young, too poor, too rich, too anything. There was no winning combination. No way to behave that could protect you completely. The quirky fringe fact? In one medieval bestiary, a kind of animal encyclopedia, a female weasel was said to conceive through her ear and give birth through her mouth. Somehow that made it into church doctrine about female mystery and deception. If that's how they thought nature worked, is it any wonder they were terrified of women with strong opinions? And let's be clear, these accusations weren't harmless. If someone called you a witch, your life could unravel fast. Even before trials and executions became common, there were punishments. You might be publicly shamed, made to wear a scold's bridle, a metal cage for your mouth, or paraded through town as a warning to others. You might be exiled, whipped, or forced to undergo penance barefoot in the cold. And even if nothing official happened, the social cost was brutal. You could be denied help during childbirth, refused alms when sick, left out of community gatherings. You who once sat at the hearth with your neighbours, now avoided like a corpse with open sores. All because you were too something, too sharp, too educated, too visible. But maybe, just maybe, you are a little magical. Not in the fire and lightning sense, but in the way you always know when someone's lying, or the way your bread always rises even when the yeast is old, or how you remember what your grandmother whispered about moon phases and bleeding, how to stop a fever with crushed yarrow, how to ward off nightmares with lavender and a blade of salt-washed wheat. You're not a witch. You're just a woman with knowledge that scares people. And that's enough. Scholars debate how women viewed these accusations in real time. Were they terrified? Defiant? Did they believe the charges themselves? Some women confessed under pressure. Torture, starvement, psychological warfare. Others refused even as they faced a punishment. Some probably didn't understand why they were being accused at all. That's what makes it so terrifying. It could come from nowhere, from a child's lie, a man's wounded pride, a crop that failed and needed a scapegoat. And here's the worst part. You can't defend yourself. Because defending yourself is proof you're clever, and clever women are suspicious. Staying silent makes you seem secretive, which is also suspicious. If someone in town has a nightmare and your name comes up in it, that's evidence. If a cow dies after you walk past the barn, that's your fault. Your life is held together by threads, and any one of them can snap if the wind shifts the wrong way. So you start folding yourself smaller. You apologise more. You make your voice softer. You laugh at the right moments, nod in the right places, shrink your thoughts until they fit inside someone else's idea of safe. But sometimes, late at night, when the candles are low and the wind rattles the shutters, you whisper the old prayers anyway. Not the church ones, the ones your mother's mother taught you. The ones about the earth and the sky and the little gods that live in moss and fire. You don't believe in them, not exactly, but they make you feel braver. And in this world, bravery is the closest thing to power. Because when being smart or strong or simply different makes you dangerous, maybe dangerous isn't the worst thing to be. Dawn breaks like it always does, and you're already awake, already moving, already wildly working. You've learned to walk through your days like a ghost, quiet, efficient, unnoticed. But you notice everything. Who's angry, who's watching, who's whispering. It's not paranoia, it's survival. Especially now as the days stretch into years and the work only deepens. You're not resting, you're not slowing down, you're not allowed to stop. You work. You always work. Paid or not, asked or not, thanked or not. You rise with the sun and move like a machine fueled by obligation and muscle memory. If you're a peasant woman, you're out in the fields before the frost thaws, turning soil with your bare hands. You're cutting herbs, dragging sacks, milking goats, hauling wood. If you're a noblewoman, you're no less busy. You're managing the entire household, directing servants, organising stores, sewing tapestries, teaching your children Latin if you're unusually well read, or pretending to care about your husband's endless political guests. But here's the truth nobody wants to admit. You're doing all this without a wage. You work from the moment you're old enough to hold a broom, and not once does anyone hand you a coin and call it yours. You might bring value to the household, economic, physical, emotional, but the system says your work isn't work. It's duty. It's accepted. And the idea of paying a woman for her labour? Absurd. That would mean recognising it as real. Let's pause for the historical fact of the night. Medieval women contributed significantly to the economy, especially in textiles, food production, and small-scale commerce. In cities like Paris and London, some women even joined trade guilds, but most were denied formal membership, forced to operate under their husband's name or work illegally from the fringes. Widows sometimes had a little more room to manoeuvre, stepping into their late husband's roles, but only until a male heir could be found. Even then, their rights were seen as temporary, like borrowed clothing they'd be expected to give back. You know what's not temporary? How utterly exhausted you are. You're working 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, with maybe a bit of mercy on Sundays, if the priest doesn't guilt you into volunteering at the church. And there's no such thing as downtime. Every free moment is filled with mending, planning, preparing or worrying. Rest is a luxury for people with servants or souls so privileged they don't think twice about the firewood chopping itself. Even when you're sick you work. Even when you're pregnant you work. Even after childbirth with stitches and fever and bones that still haven't settled, you work. Because the bread won't bake itself. The children won't stop crying. The animals won't feed themselves. You don't get the flu. You get tired. You don't get depression. You get lazy. You don't get burned out. You get punished by God for not being grateful. Now, here's your quirky historical nugget. In some villages, women were tasked with baking the community's communion bread, and if the loaf wasn't just right, the entire village blamed them for any spiritual misfortunes that followed. Imagine being held responsible for everyone's eternal damnation because your dough didn't rise properly, all while being unpaid for the labour. Let's not forget what you're not allowed to do. Own property, not without a male guardian. Keep your earnings from a market stall, only if your husband agrees. Take a job as a scholar, a scribe, or, heaven forbid, a teacher. Not unless you've taken vows and locked yourself in a convent, and even then, you'll probably just be illuminating someone else's words. You do the work, but someone else takes the credit. And when a man does the exact same tasks, it's called skill. It's a trade. It's something you can list on a guild application. When you do it, it's just part of being a woman. You're naturally good at spinning or sewing or organising a household. Never mind that you've spent decades perfecting your craft. Never mind that your fingers bleed from weaving or that you can butcher a pig with surgical precision. That's not real work, it's just what you do. You can't unionise, you can't sue, you can't even complain too loudly. Or someone might decide you're a nasty woman and accuse you of being bitter, or barren, or bewitched. So instead, you say, thank you. You smile when someone notices the pie you spent 4 hours baking. You nod when your husband brags about how well the household runs under his watchful eye. You bite your tongue so hard it bleeds. Scholars still argue over whether medieval women felt oppressed in the modern sense of the word. Some claim women found pride and satisfaction in their roles, that they held more informal power than the records show. Others point out the glaring inequality of every system they lived under, how even their freedoms were controlled, conditional, or thinly veiled burdens. Either way, here you are. Elbows deep in barley flour, calves aching from crouching at the fire, fingers stained with dye and soot and God knows what else. You don't stop because stopping isn't an option. You don't ask for help because help isn't offered. And you certainly don't dream of a different life. That's not sayonara, dreaming gets you in trouble. But sometimes in those rare seconds between chores, when the sun hits just right through a high window, or when your child laughs in their sleep and you think about what it would feel like to have your work seen, not just used but valued, not just expected but rewarded. You imagine someone placing a coin in your palm and saying, thank you, that was good work. and for a second that fantasy is heavier than any sack of grain you've ever carried. You're standing in the doorway of a stone chapel, watching the nuns file by in silence. Their feet whisper against the cold floor, robes swaying like shadows. They don't look at you, not directly, but you feel their attention all the same, subtle as breath. You're thinking about joining them, not out of sudden devotion or love for God, but because honestly the convent is starting to look like the most peaceful option you've got. For a woman in the Middle Ages, becoming a nun is one of the only ways to escape marriage, childbirth, and the grind of endless domestic labour. It's not an easy life, but it is a different one, and that alone makes it tempting. You've heard stories that behind those stone walls women can read, learn, teach, write, even manage estates. No men touching you, no screaming infants, no husband with wine on his breath asking where the hell his boots are. Just prayer, work, and, if you're lucky, a little peace. That said, convent life isn't a fairy tale, it's cold, strict, often underfunded. Meals are small and repetitive. Beans, pottage, stale bread softened with wine. There's no privacy. You share a dormitory with a dozen other women, some of whom snore, weep at night, or hum strange tunes in their sleep. You're woken before dawn for matins and spend hours in chilly chapels chanting in Latin until your lips go numb. And yet, it's better. Here's your historical fact. Nunneries in the medieval period were often hubs of education. Some convents housed extensive libraries, preserved classical texts, and trained women to read, write, and copy manuscripts. A few even taught Latin and basic medicine. While most men were out stabbing each other or getting dysentery in the Crusades, nuns were quietly keeping literacy alive behind high stone walls. And for some women, this life isn't just tolerable, it's fulfilling. You might become a prioress, a scribe, or even an abbess, running an entire religious community. That kind of power, unthinkable outside the convent. You might correspond with scholars, you might write hymns, you might even get a say in political decisions, especially if your nunnery owns land. It's not freedom in the modern sense, but it's the closest most women ever get. Still, it doesn't come without trade-offs. You'll never marry, you'll never have children. You'll take a vow of obedience, poverty, and chastity. That means no secrets, no spending, and definitely no late-night trysts with the carpenter's son, no matter how good his hands look when he's carving altar rails. And the chastity? It isn't just about sex. It's about letting go of any claim to your own body. Your hair is cut, your clothes are plain, your voice, if it was ever loud, is softened to a whisper. Then there's the theology. You're reminded daily that as a woman, your body is weak, your mind suspect, is your soul more easily led into temptation. Eve is still your shadow. The sermons are filled with warnings about pride, about disobedience, about what happens to women who think too much or speak too plainly. You must be humble, you must submit. Even in a space designed for women, you're still defined by what you lack, mainly a penis. Quirky fact break, in some nunneries, particularly in northern France, the sisters kept cats, not just for catching mice, but as quiet companions. There are actual accounts of nuns writing marginal notes in their manuscripts about their cats walking across the pages. So yes, there's a real chance you'd be reading the Psalms with a tabby curled in your lap, purring like a tiny judgmental bishop. But despite the solemnity and the rules, something about the convent still feels revolutionary. Maybe because it offers you something no other role in society does. A bit of control. You decide how your time is spent. You pursue knowledge. You build relationships with other women based on intellect, not rivalry. You create something, preserve something, grow something that isn't just another child or batch of barley. And sometimes the convent becomes a haven for women who've lost everything. Widows, abandoned wives, even young girls spared from early marriage by wealthy relatives who donate them to the church. Some enter willingly, some don't, not all are happy. But inside those walls, their lives take a different shape, one that doesn't revolve around a husband's mood or the weight of a pregnancy. Scholars argue about the convent's true role. Was it liberation or confinement? Some say it was a gilded cage, just another patriarchal institution dressed in rosary beads and Latin chants. Others argue that it was subversive, that women used their vows to escape social norms, live among peers, and assert intellectual and spiritual power in a world that denied them both. And you? You're still standing at the threshold, Maybe you'll go in, maybe you won't, maybe your parents already paid your dowry to a convent and didn't tell you until your wedding dress was halfway stitched. Or maybe you're already wearing the robes, folding laundry in the cloister, humming a hymn while thinking about the life you might have lived outside these walls. Either way, the choice or illusion of choice marks a rare moment where your story branches. Outside you're a wife, a worker, a womb. Inside you're still all of those things, but you're also something else. A voice in a chorus, a keeper of words, a woman allowed to exist for herself, even if only in whispers and candlelight. Because in a world where almost every door is locked to you, the convent might be the only one that doesn't slam in your face. You've broken a rule, nothing big, nothing worth talking about. Maybe you wore the wrong thing to mass, too much colour, too much skin, or God forbid, a smile that lasted a second too long. Maybe you answered back when someone barked at you. Maybe you were seen in the marketplace unaccompanied, or someone thought they saw you talking to a man who wasn't your husband. Doesn't matter. You broke a rule, or looked like you were about to, or someone just wanted to say you did, and now the law is watching. The thing is, the law was never made to protect you. It exists to contain you. Medieval laws don't see you as a citizen or an individual. You're not a participant. You're property. You belong to your father, then your husband, and if you're very unlucky, your son. If you're unmarried, you're suspect. If you're widowed, you're vulnerable. If you're alone, you're prey. The law isn't there to guard you from harm, it's there to remind you who's in charge. Want the cold truth? In most places during the Middle Ages, if your husband beats you, the law shrugs, unless he kills you outright or beats you in public so brutally that a witness steps in. No one cares. In fact, the law encourages a man to correct his wife as he sees fit. Moderate chastisement is considered his right, and the definition of moderate is as flexible as his mood. Now for your historical fact. The legal doctrine of coverture, which later formalised in English common law, had its roots in the Middle Ages. Under coverture, a woman had no separate legal identity after marriage. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or sue in her own name. She was covered by her husband, legally absorbed, like a ghost in a legal document, present but without a voice. You find yourself trapped in absurd double standards. If a man cheats, it's weakness. If you cheat, it's treason, literally. In some courts, female adultery is tried as a crime against the husband's property, and if he decides to murder you for it, there's a decent chance he'll get off with a fine. That's if you're highborn. If you're a peasant, the penalty could be even more literal. Death by drowning, stoning, or, in especially theatrical towns, being locked in a barrel and rolled down a hill. Because if you're going to punish a woman, might as well make it public. Now here's a fringe fact to spice your nightmares. In parts of medieval Scotland, women accused of nagging too much could be punished with a scold's bridle, a heavy iron cage strapped around the head, complete with a flat metal plate that went into the mouth to press down the tongue. It was designed not just to silence, but to humiliate. You'd be paraded through the village like a cautionary tale, proof that a woman who talks too much will be forcibly turned into furniture. If you're the victim of a crime, assault, theft, rape, getting justice is almost impossible. You need male witnesses. You need a good reputation. You need your attacker to not be someone important or powerful or simply more believable than you. And if you accuse someone and lose the case, you could be punished for slander. So most women don't speak up, not because they're weak, but because they're smart enough to know it won't end well. The church, of course, has its own brand of justice. Confession, penance, excommunication. Your soul is constantly at risk, and you're told that your body is the gateway to all sin. If you step out of line, even just emotionally say, you're too proud or you envy someone's embroidery, you're warned of eternal fire. It doesn't matter if the rules contradict each other. You're supposed to follow them all anyway. And what about your children? If your son steals a chicken, he might be whipped or fined. If your daughter is suspected of immoral behaviour, whatever that means, she might be publicly flogged or even married off to correct her. The solution to a wayward girl is almost always the same. Hand her to a man and hope she stops embarrassing everyone. Because again, you're not a person. You're a problem to be managed. Scholars debate how rigid these systems really were. Some legal codes included protections for women, especially widows or mothers of soldiers. Some towns had courts that allowed women to bring complaints, but the reality depended on your location, your class, your connections, and your luck. One bad judge, one angry neighbour, one jealous rival, and you could lose everything: your land, your children, your life. And of course you don't write the laws, you don't interpret them, you don't enforce them. That's all done by men who see the world through a lens that doesn't include your suffering, unless it inconveniences them. So even when you obey the rules, you're still at risk, because the law is like the weather. It changes without warning, and no one cares if it flattens your roof. Sometimes you wonder what justice might look like if it was made for people like you, if the courts heard your voice, if your pain was counted, if there were consequences for the things that break you. But that's not this world. In this world, justice is just another man's name on another man's scroll. So you do what you must. You stay small, you stay quiet. You learn which doors to knock on and which ones to avoid. You teach your daughter to hold her tongue and walk fast. You hope your son turns out kind, even though everything around him teaches him not to be. Because when the law doesn't protect you, survival becomes your only defence. Not truth, not fairness, just making it to the next day without giving them a reason to notice you. You're tightening the laces of your bodice, pulling until your ribs creak. Not because you want to, because you're expected to. Appearance matters. It always has. In this world, your face is your fortune, and your clothing is your resume. Before you speak a word, you've already been judged by your hemline and your hair, your posture, and whether your shoes are the right shade of brown or just suspiciously peasant. Fashion in the Middle Ages isn't about fun, it's not about self-expression or flair. It's about class, obedience, and knowing your place. A woman dressed above her station risks ridicule, suspicion, even punishment. The wrong garment on the wrong body becomes a threat. Because if a low-born woman starts looking noble, then how is anyone supposed to know where she belongs? So you dress carefully. If you're poor, you make do with wool, rough, scratchy, plain. You dye it with plant scraps and wear it until it nearly falls apart. If you're noble, you get linen and silk, fur in the winter, colours like crimson or deep blue that scream status. But even then you don't choose freely. Your family does, your husband does, the sumptuary laws do. Yes, there are laws about what women can wear. Want to know what colour you can wear based on your husband's income? The Crown's got a chart for that. Let's talk about the historical fact of the night. Sumptuary laws were widespread in medieval Europe. They regulated what materials and colours you could wear, depending on your social rank. In England, for example, only royalty and the highest-ranking nobles could wear cloth of gold or purple silk. Lesser women were banned from certain trimmings, embroidery styles, or even types of buttons. Heaven forbid you look expensive without permission. And shoes, don't even get started on shoes. There's a brief but baffling period where pointy-toed footwear called poulaines becomes fashionable. The longer the toe, the more elite the wearer. Some noble women hobble around with toes so long they need to be tied up with tiny chains to avoid tripping. Meanwhile, you're probably barefoot, stepping over dung and praying you don't get hookworm. Fashion, the great divider. But it's not just what you wear, so we wear. It's how you wear it. Are you modest, covered, veiled? If your hair is loose past a certain age, people raise their eyebrows. If your neckline dips too low, accidentally or otherwise, you risk being labelled wanton. People act like your body is a danger just waiting to happen. Something about a visible collarbone that makes a priest clutch his rosary like it's about to fly out of his hands. And here's the ironic twist. The rules of modesty aren't consistent. In one town, bare arms are fine. In the next, scandalous. Sometimes veils are required by law. Other times, they are just expected. Either way, if you don't follow the dress code, no matter how impossible it is to interpret, you're judged. And not just by the church or the crown, by other women too, especially those trying to stay safe by blending in. Now for the weird fringe fact. Lead-based cosmetics were sometimes used by wealthy women to lighten their skin. That's right. They literally poisoned themselves for fashion. Paleness meant purity. It also meant you didn't have to work outside, which meant you were rich. So some women applied powders containing vinegar, chalk and lead to achieve that ethereal, I've never been touched by sunlight or labour look. Bonus points if you fainted now and then. Weakness was considered elegant. Hair was another battlefield. Blonde was the most desirable shade, supposedly angelic, delicate and impossibly expensive to achieve if you weren't born with it. Women soaked their hair in lye and sat in the sun for hours to bleach it, even knowing it might fall out in clumps. Eyebrows were plucked into oblivion or shaved completely, and high foreheads were so fashionable that women removed their hairline with tweezers or pumice stones to create the illusion of a taller brow. Beauty Standards, Medieval Edition. And don't think men didn't notice, they absolutely did. Poets wrote sonnets about your eyes, your lips, your hair like spun gold, but if you actually tried to look beautiful on purpose, that was vanity, and vanity conveniently was a sin. A woman who drew attention to herself was a temptation. A woman who failed to look pleasing was a disgrace. You had to walk a tightrope between desirable and demure, between lovely and invisible. You get dressed in the morning knowing that your outfit could be read as flirtation, defiance, laziness, ambition, or piety, all at once. Nothing is neutral. Even your belt placement has implications. And no matter how hard you try to get it right, someone will always find a reason to tut disapprovingly behind your back. There's debate among scholars about how seriously sumptuary laws were enforced. Some say they were mostly symbolic, guidelines that shape behaviour without much punishment. Others argue that in certain cities, breaking the fashion code could lead to public shaming, fines, or even physical punishment. But either way, the point wasn't enforcement, it was control. Remind people, especially women, that they are watched. So you learn to dress strategically. Not too fine, not too plain, nothing that suggests you're trying to rise above your station, nothing that suggests you've given up completely. You become a master of restraint, and managing your appearance the way a diplomat manages a treaty, carefully, subtly, defensively. And as you grow older, the rules shift again. Now you're expected to fade gracefully. Your body is no longer valued, but it's still policed. If you look too young, people whisper. If you look too old, they stop looking at all. Either way you disappear, but not before they take one last inventory of your wrinkles, your greying hair, your bent spine, your frayed hem. You never win the game of fashion in the Middle Ages. At best, you survive it. At worst, it becomes one more reason for the world to crush you under its heel and say, she brought it on herself. So tomorrow you'll get dressed again. Pin your veil, cinch your belt, pull your bodice tight and step into the world like a silent negotiation. Not because you believe in the rules, but because you know the cost of breaking them. You catch your reflection in a pool of rainwater, distorted, rippling, barely there. Still, you pause. You're trying to see yourself the way others see you, but it's hard when their expectations are always shifting, always narrowing. Being a woman in the Middle Ages means you are, above all else, an image, constructed, judged, picked apart. You're told what to look like, how to carry yourself, where to stand, when to smile, but nowhere along the line are you ever asked how it feels to live inside that image. Beauty in your world isn't a bonus, it's a burden. It's not about self-expression or identity. It's a form of moral performance. You're expected to be pale but not sickly, plump but not idle, youthful but not flirtatious, clean but not vain. It's like being trapped in a portrait someone else is constantly painting over, telling you you're wrong before you even know what you're supposed to be. Your body is not your own. It's public property, a canvas for religious judgment, male fantasy and communal scrutiny. You're not beautiful for yourself. You're beautiful for your husband, for your father's reputation, for the town's peace of mind. And if you're not beautiful, that too is seen as your fault. Ugly women are punished. Beautiful women are punished. Everyone loses. Let's dig into the historical fact early. Medieval beauty standards prized light skin, high foreheads, small features, and soft, rounded bodies, though the specifics shifted with region and time. The emphasis was always the same. The woman's beauty was seen as a reflection of her morality and status. If you were pale and delicate, it meant you didn't labour in the fields. If you had fine hair and dainty fingers, it meant you were modest and well-bred. Inner virtue was measured by outer appearance, and that metric was always rigged. Sound exhausting? It is. And yet you try to conform. Not because you believe in the system, but because the consequences of not conforming are worse. Or if you're too loud, you're a shrew. Too plain, you're overlooked. Too confident, you're dangerous. Too attractive, you're suspicious. There's no winning face to wear, only faces to avoid. So you scrape your skin with rough cloth to make it paler. You rub vinegar on your cheeks to flush them. You darken your eyelashes with soot and olive oil. You pluck your eyebrows until they're little more than a memory, and you widen your forehead with a razor because someone somewhere decided that looking vaguely alien made you more noble. All while pretending it's not for attention, just for God, for duty, for decency. Fringe fact time, In parts of medieval Italy, women used belladonna, deadly nightshade, to dilate their pupils and give them a wide-eyed, innocent look. Just a drop or two in the eyes. Never mind the blurred vision, the burning, or the possibility of going blind. As long as you looked like a living painting of Mary, you were winning. Except you're not. Because these beauty standards are rigged against your survival. They punish aging like a crime. Wrinkles are a sin. Grey hair is failure. Sagging skin is shame. If you're a mother, you're supposed to look like you never gave birth. If you're married, you're supposed to stay forever young. And if you don't, you become invisible. Or worse, pitied. And beauty is always tethered to virtue. If you're attractive, you're a temptation, a risk to the community's spiritual health. Priests preach about your dangerous curves. Scholars write about how a woman's beauty can poison the minds of men. There are actual manuals for monks on how to avoid lustful thoughts when faced with female temptresses, a category that includes literally every woman over the age of 12. You're not a person, you're a test, and if a man sins because he looked at you, that's on you. You wore the wrong colour, your sleeve slipped. You laughed too freely, you existed in a way that drew his eye. Never mind what you intended. Intention means nothing when you're a walking moral hazard. So what do? You shrink yourself, you lower your gaze, you learn to read a room faster than you learn to read scripture. You smile just enough to appear pleasant, not enough to appear eager. You speak softly but clearly, unless you're in a setting where speaking at all would be taken as arrogance. You age quietly, hide flaws under powder, and keep your pain tucked behind your teeth. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how widespread or rigid these beauty ideals really were. Some argue that most rural women simply didn't have the means or time to worry about these things. Survival trumped aesthetics. Others argue that while fashion might have varied, the pressure to conform to someone's vision of feminine virtue was universal. Whether you were rich or poor, peasant or princess, someone was always watching you and measuring your worth in cheekbones and humility. And if you ever dare to push back, if you cut your hair short, refuse a veil, walk boldly into a space meant for men, expect backlash. Not just gossip, not just disapproval. Actual consequences. You might be scolded, excommunicated, even accused of sorcery. Because nonconformity isn't just unattractive, it's unholy. Still, there are moments. Small, private ones. You catch yourself in that same pool of rainwater and think, I'm not ugly, I'm just tired. You remember how your daughter touches your face with awe, or how the midwife once called your eyes wolf eyes. Not a compliment, but not an insult either. Just something raw, something alive. Sometimes you tie your hair with a ribbon that makes you feel light. You run a cloth dipped in rosewater over your arms, just for yourself. You breathe in the scent and think, I am still here, no matter what they say, no matter how they look at you. You don't belong to their vision. You belong to yourself, even if you can only admit that in secret. And in this world where your face is never just a face, that act of quiet ownership might be the bravest thing you ever do. You're kneeling, again. Your knees are bruised from stone floors, your fingers numb from the cold, and the incense makes your eyes sting. But you stay there, whispering your prayers, trying to look humble. Because in this world, religion isn't just faith. It's structure, surveillance, identity. It tells you who you are, and if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, it tells you, over and over again, that you are the problem. Everywhere you turn, you're reminded, Eve, that's where it started. One bite of fruit, and now you bleed every month, suffer in childbirth, and live under the rule of men. The sermons tell you you're the gateway to sin, the original traitor. Your very body is a warning to others. Men are strong and spiritual. Women are weak and carnal. That's the foundation, the lesson carved into wood and stone and scripture. You want to believe in something. You really do. The songs are beautiful. The stained glass glows like trapped fire. And sometimes during Mass you feel something, peace maybe, connection, a flicker of joy. But then the priest starts in on women again. Your voice is too loud, your presence is too distracting, your temptation too powerful, and your soul? Well, good luck purifying that without a lifetime of servitude. Here's your historical fact for the night. In the medieval church, women were considered spiritually inferior by default. Most clergy believed women had to submit to male spiritual authority at all times. That's why women couldn't be priests. or hear confessions or administer sacraments. Their role was to be silent, penitent, and preferably invisible. If they were especially lucky, they might become nuns, but even then they were expected to defer to male bishops. The Bible isn't on your side, at least not the way it's interpreted here. You're told to be meek like Mary, obedient like Sarah, patient like Ruth. The church loves a quiet, suffering woman. Saints are women who died virgins or mothers who prayed through unthinkable loss without complaint. Martyrs who said nothing as they burned. Your value lies in endurance, not resistance. Now let's take a detour into the absurd. Medieval theologians actually debated whether women had full human souls. No, really. Some claimed women had weaker souls that needed male guidance. Others argued that, while women did have souls, they were more susceptible to demonic possession due to their moist and open nature. The idea was that since women's bodies were more permeable, literally and metaphorically, they were easier targets for Satan. So yes, once again, your biology is a cosmic liability. And speaking of demons, women were seen as more likely to consort with the devil. Why? Because of your emotional nature, your insatiable curiosity, and of course your sexuality. Lust wasn't just frowned upon, it was weaponized. If a man had impure thoughts, it was because you tempted him. If he acted on them, still your fault. Your body caused his sin, your smile summoned his downfall. So you try to disappear inside your faith. You cross yourself with trembling fingers. You confess sins you didn't know you committed. You attend Mass, even when your body aches, because being seen at church is as much about survival as salvation. You light candles for your children, your mother, your aching knees, and you try not to cry when the priest preaches another homily about the treacherous nature of women. You listen to stories of female saints and try to find something to hold on to. Hildegard of Bingen wrote music and theology. Wasn't she respected? Yes, but only after visions deemed her divine. Julian of Norwich had profound revelations, but only after almost dying. These women didn't climb, they suffered. They weren't praised for speaking, they were tolerated for surviving. And only when men decided their suffering had value. The church tells you your body is impure, but still demands you baptize every child you bear. They tell you your voice is dangerous, but ask you to sing hymns in perfect unison. They warn you against pride, but expect flawless attendance and spotless veils. They condemn you for being born a woman, and then assign you every domestic virtue, every spiritual burden, every drop of guilt in the basin. And if you're widowed, watch your step. You're suddenly more visible, more vulnerable. Alone in the pew, alone at confession, alone at the mercy of a church that no longer sees you as protected. Some widows are respected, sure, but only the quiet ones, the ones who wear black and say nothing. The others, who speak, who ask for property rights, who show up at legal proceedings, are viewed with suspicion. Because what's scarier than a woman with no man to control her? One with nothing left to lose. Scholars debate how much power medieval women truly had within religion. Some argue that pious women found their voices through mysticism, prayer, or charitable work. Others point out that the church's structure was built to silence women, not uplift them. Even the most celebrated female visionaries were only taken seriously when their revelations aligned with church doctrine, and even then, their words were filtered, edited, and approved by male scribes. Still, you cling to the scraps of comfort religion offers. The quiet of the chapel, the hush of prayers in a cold room, the feel of candle wax on your fingers as you offer another silent plea for health, for protection, for mercy. You press your forehead to the stone and beg, not for miracles, but for permission to keep breathing. And maybe that's faith, or maybe it's just survival with a halo on it. But you kneel again tomorrow, because if you don't, someone will ask why, and the last thing you need is another reason for people to question your virtue. So you bow your head, fold your hands, and whisper the only words you're allowed to say aloud. Lord, have mercy on me, a woman. He's dead, just like that. One moment he's coughing over the porridge, the next he's slumped in the chair, eyes open, but seeing nothing. Your husband, your provider, your captor, your shadow, he's gone, and for the first time in years, the house is silent. No booming voice asking where his cloak is, no drunken slurs muttered from the hearth, no demands, no footsteps, no breathing but your own. You'd think that would feel like freedom, it doesn't. It feels like danger, because being a widow in the Middle Ages doesn't come with sympathy casseroles and well-wishers. It comes with suspicion, vulnerability, and paperwork you can't read. The minute your husband dies, the world starts circling. Neighbours, priests, local lords, family members you barely know, everyone wants to know what you plan to do next. Where you'll go, who you'll marry, what you have, what you're hiding. And you are hiding. Everything that might matter. The extra bolts of wool, the silver spoon he never used, the candle ends you've been saving. You bury them in the root cellar because the vultures are coming, and if you don't protect what's left, you'll have nothing. Here's your historical fact. Widows in the Middle Ages were one of the only groups of women legally allowed to own property, manage estates, or represent themselves in court. Sounds progressive, right? But that power was conditional, limited by class and location, and almost always temporary. Widows were expected to remarry, often within months, especially if they were young or had land. Because heaven forbid a woman exist without a man telling her what to do. And if your husband didn't leave a will, things get dicey fast. Maybe you're allowed to keep 1/3 of the estate, if the church approves it. Maybe the land reverts to his brother. Maybe a cousin you've never met shows up with a forged document and a smug smile. You try to argue, but your voice has no legal weight. You might be allowed to speak, but no one is listening. That's when the rumours start. That you poisoned him, that you didn't cry hard enough at the burial, that you've been too cheerful lately, that you let your hair down in the garden. People stare longer now. Men eye you like they're shopping. Women glance at you like you've grown horns. You're not just a widow, you're a wild card. Let's take a moment for a fringe fact. In some parts of medieval Eastern Europe, widows were expected to participate in ritualised mourning for up to a year. That meant black clothing, no laughter, no dancing, no socialising. If you were seen smiling before your mourning period ended, people might say you were consorting with spirits, or worse, that you are already seducing your next husband. Because God forbid a woman be happy when she's no longer being beaten twice a week. And here's the real horror. Widowhood doesn't make you safe. It makes you available. If your husband was a good man, his friends might protect you by marrying you off to someone even older, or even worse. If he was cruel, nobody cares. Either way, you're expected to hand over your freedom like it's overdue library parchment. Because a woman living alone, that's a loose thread in the social fabric. If you have sons, they might inherit. If they're old enough, you might get to stay in your home and act as a sort of housekeeper for your own children. If they're young, the estate could be managed by a male relative on their behalf, which means not on yours. You'll get a corner room and some cold porridge and a reminder that your job is over. And if you have daughters, that's a different headache entirely. They're suddenly seen as unprotected, and unprotected is code for target. People will assume you're desperate to marry them off, and they're not wrong. Better a bad match than no match. Better a sickly man with some land than a charming one with a nothing. Because in widowhood, your daughter's virtue is tied directly to your own. If she slips, even slightly, people won't just blame her. They'll blame you. Historians debate whether widows in the Middle Ages had more autonomy than other women. Some did. There are records of widows running taverns, managing businesses, even suing male relatives in court. But these are exceptions. For most, widowhood was a tightrope. Too independent, and you're shunned. Too vulnerable, and you're devoured. And if you do find someone to marry again, you'd better hope he's kind, because the second marriage rarely offers more freedom than the first. Once remarried, your brief flash of legal independence vanishes like smoke. Your new husband controls your property, your children, your movements, your choices. The only thing you might keep is the memory of that short, strange window when you were alone. And no one could tell you how to sleep or who to be. There's another option, of course. The convent. Again, it's always there, looming in the distance like a stone sanctuary. For some widows it's a haven. For others, a prison with a different warden. You could take vows and spend the rest of your days in silence, sewing and praying, trying not to dwell on everything you've lost, or everything you never got to have. It's a way out, but it's not always a way forward. So you live in limbo, you mourn a man you maybe didn't love, you manage a house that maybe isn't yours, you try to plan for a future that might vanish the moment another man signs a scroll, and you keep your head down. Because one misstep, one wrong word, one smirk, one open window on the wrong day, and they'll remind you that your status was never about your strength. It was about who you were attached to, and now that attachment is gone. You thought widowhood might be a beginning. It isn't. It's just a different kind of trap painted in black and whispered through half-closed doors. You're not a wife. You're not a maid. You're not a mother whose children are still small enough to hold. You're something else, something the world doesn't know what to do with. And that makes you dangerous. You don't appear in the storybooks, not really. If you do, it's as a footnote. His wife, a servant, a local woman, no name, no age, no detail beyond your function in a man's plotline. You're the background, the flicker of a figure carrying a picture in a tapestry, the faint ink smudge beside a knight's name in a family tree, the one who kept the household while the men rode off to be remembered. And when you die, your name fades faster than your body. History doesn't preserve you. It brushes past you like you were never there. You know you existed. You remember the feel of coarse linen on your skin, the ache in your hands from kneading dough, the sound of your baby's cry in the middle of the night. But none of that gets written down. There's no parchment for your pain, no monument to your survival. Unless you're royalty or scandalous or holy in just the right way, your life becomes compost for the great gilded stories of men. Let's get into tonight's historical fact. Most surviving medieval documents were written by and for men. Legal codes, property records, chronicles, sermons. Women's names appear mostly in baptism registers, marriage contracts and death notices. That's it. If you wanted to leave a mark, you had to be wealthy, exceptional, or very, very obedient. And even then, the scribes might forget you had thoughts of your own. The manuscripts survive, the ink fades, but the script endures. Yet rarely does it mention the woman who copied it, the nun who illuminated the page in gold, the servant girl who swept the floor of the scriptorium, the woman who raised the boy who wrote the history. You're everywhere in the past, just never visible. And it's not just that your name's missing, it's your voice, the thoughts you whispered to yourself in the dark, the arguments you bit back during supper, the jokes you shared with your friend while darning socks, all of it gone, because to the people who wrote history, those thoughts weren't worth recording. They wanted kings, wars, saints, not the daily lives of women who scraped mould off bread and negotiated peace between quarrelling children before sunrise. Some scholars try to reconstruct you from scraps, court records, wills, letters. They find glimpses. A woman who lent money in Venice, a midwife in York who had a dozen clients, a washerwoman in Prague who got in a fistfight at the market and won. Little pieces like broken pottery. They try to piece you together, but most of you is missing. Now here's a fringe fact that's both sweet and slightly tragic. In some monastic cookbooks, women's notes appear in the margins, tiny handwritten asides about how to fix a recipe or substitute ingredients when the beets are rotting again. These weren't the official authors. They were the cooks, the sisters, the ones doing the real work. And even though no one asked for their thoughts, they left them anyway. Quiet rebellion in the form of better soup. But outside those margins, the story goes on without you. Kings are crowned, wars are fought, cities fall, and the chroniclers mention famine, but not the women who starved first. They mention battles, but not the wives who searched the fields afterward. They write of plagues, but not the girls who boiled water for the dying, while their own skin blistered. Even art does it. In stained glass, you're the figure behind Mary. In paintings, you're the anonymous woman holding a basket or staring off to the side. In sculpture, you're rendered modest and silent, eyes lowered, body draped in folds that suggest piety but never power. Your likeness is shaped by someone else's idea of what you should be, never what you were, and what you were was everything. Without you, the grain isn't ground, the candles aren't dipped, the children aren't raised, the wounded aren't nursed, the sick aren't buried, the bread isn't baked, the fires aren't lit. But history has a habit of only recording what happens in public, and your life was lived in the corners, in kitchens and cellars, in the shadows of drafty halls. There's ongoing debate about how intentional this erasure really was. Some say it was deliberate, patriarchal systems designed to suppress women's contributions. Others say it was structural, that the absence of records reflects the reality of literacy and access, not active malice. But to you it doesn't matter. You're still gone. And worse, you knew you would be. That's why when you're alone, you sometimes try to remember yourself harder. You trace your name in the soot of the hearth, just to see it somewhere. You carve your initials into a wooden spoon, hide a symbol on the hem of a dress. Tiny acts of defiance. Not enough to rewrite history, but maybe enough to haunt it. Because deep down, you know you deserve to be seen, not just as a mother or a wife or a witch or a widow, but as a person. A woman who lived through this grinding, smoke-choked, plague-ridden century with strength that was never praised because it was never optional. You existed, even if they don't say your name, even if your grave is unmarked, even if your stories never made it past your daughter's ears. You were here. And maybe that's why we tell this story now, why we drag your memory out of the margins and dust it off. Because you mattered, because you still... and because someone should have said your name while you were still alive to hear it. You're squinting at a page, not because the candle's too low, though it is, but because you're not sure you're even supposed to be looking. Reading for you isn't guaranteed. It's not taught, not expected, and certainly not encouraged. A woman with a book in her hand? That's suspicious. A woman who understands what's written inside? Downright dangerous. Still your fingers hover near the parchment, and your eyes trace the dark strokes of ink like they're forbidden fruit. For most women in the Middle Ages, education is a luxury wrapped in a barrier. Class, gender, language, all of them stand between you and knowledge. If you're poor, forget it. Your world is oral, songs, proverbs, instructions shouted across a field. If you're a merchant's daughter, you might be taught how to keep accounts or write a simple letter. If you're noble, maybe a tutor teaches you Latin prayers. But literacy, real, usable, personal literacy, that's rare, that's radical. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval societies, female literacy rates were extremely low, especially outside religious institutions. Where women did learn to read, it was usually limited to religious texts, and often in Latin, a language they weren't fluent in. Most girls weren't taught to write at all. Reading was to receive knowledge, writing was to generate it, and that, clearly, was too much power to hand over. And yet some of you find a way. You sneak peeks at your brother's lessons, you beg the parish priest to teach you a letter or two, you trace words in the dirt with a stick while pretending to draw stars, because knowing how to read, even a little, opens up a sliver of the world that was never meant to belong to you. And oh, the books themselves. Most are chained to monastery shelves or hoarded by noblemen like holy relics. Each manuscript takes months, sometimes years, to produce. Hand-copied, illuminated, stitched into leather. They're too expensive to own, too precious to lend. And the contents? Mostly theology, legal texts, sermons, and epic tales about men doing very important things, while women sit quietly or die tragically to advance the plot, but every now and then you find something different. A prayer written in the margins in a woman's hand, a herbal recipe tucked into the flyleaf, a personal note scrawled beside a psalm. My son died this week. My heart is made of stone. Just one sentence, no name, no context, but it echoes louder than the whole book. Quirky fact time, some medieval books included, girdle bindings, covers with long fabric tails that women could tie around their waists and wear beneath their gowns. That way the book was hidden, kept close, protected. Sometimes it was a prayer book, sometimes a small treatise on womanly virtue, sometimes a private journal that no one else was meant to read. Secret wisdom tied to the body like a second soul. If you're lucky enough to become a nun, your access improves. Inside convent walls, women sometimes run scriptoria, places where manuscripts are copied and preserved. You could be the one illuminating the letter A with gold leaf, or correcting a misspelled Latin phrase. But even here, your role is limited. You're copying texts written by men, chosen by men, preserved for men. Your own thoughts remain unrecorded, unless you dare to sneak them into the margins. Scholars still debate how widespread female literacy really was. Some point to household inventories listing prayer books for the lady. Others note the sheer number of anonymous poems, letters, and songs clearly written by women, even if the names were lost or erased. There were educated women, yes, but the question remains, were they the exception or the tip of an undocumented iceberg? What's certain is that education comes with risk. A woman who reads too much is unnatural. A woman who writes? That's terrifying. Because writing means permanence, it means self-expression, it means refusing to disappear. You put ink to parchment and suddenly your thoughts live longer than your body. That's not supposed to happen. Not for someone like you, but maybe you write anyway. At night, by slivered candlelight, in the margins of your husband's Bible or the back of a grain ledger. You write not because you expect someone to read it, but because it's the only place you can say what you really think. That the priest's sermon didn't sit right, that your daughter is smarter than the boys, that you dreamed of another life balance and sometimes still do. You write even knowing the risks, that someone might find it and laugh, or worse, report you. That the ink itself could betray you, your pen scratches deemed vanity or rebellion. But the words come anyway, like water pressing against a dam. You press them down into the parchment like seeds, not knowing if they'll grow, only hoping they'll last. And maybe one day, centuries later, someone finds your note, someone reading a dusty book in a library on the other side of the world. They see your handwriting, crooked, careful, and pause. They tilt the page to the light. They read your words, and in that moment you are not forgotten, you are not erased, you are known, not because a man wrote you into a story, but because you wrote yourself into the silence and made it sing. Your body has never belonged to you, not once, not in birth, not in marriage, not in death. From the moment you were born, someone else had a claim on it. Your father, your priest, your husband, your midwife, your lord. But more than anyone, the world has something to say about your body. What it looks like, what it does, what it wants, and more often than not, what it ruins. You carry your body through the day like it's a burden, like it's something to manage before it betrays you. You walk with your head down so no one thinks you're proud. You cover your hair because it's too distracting. You wear layers even in the heat, because bare skin is always an invitation, even when it's not, especially when it's not. And still your body is accused. Of what? Everything. Of lust, of sin, of sickness, of being the reason men can't control themselves, of causing storms, failed harvests, even war. There are sermons blaming women for plagues. There are songs that liken your hips to snares, your lips to traps, your gaze to a poisoned blade. You start to believe it, sometimes, that simply existing is dangerous. Tonight's historical fact might not surprise you, but it still stings. During the Black Death in the 14th century, many communities blamed women, specifically old women and healers, for the spread of the disease. They were accused of poisoning wells, communing with demons, or carrying disease in their unclean bodies. Even though the actual causes of the plague were completely unknown, women's bodies became the scapegoat. Again, you learn early on that your health isn't yours to speak of. Too much bleeding, keep quiet. Pain during childbirth, bear it in silence. Miscarriage, you must have sinned. Illness, probably brought on by impure thoughts or a failure to confess. The priests say your suffering is sacred. The doctors say it's hysteria. Either way, you're not the expert on your own body. And don't even try to explain how you feel. The prevailing medical theory, the four humours, says that women are cold and wet by nature. That means you're more emotional, more fragile, more changeable. It also means you're to blame for most of your own ailments. Too much black bile? That's why you're melancholic. Too much phlegm? No wonder you're slow and sad. Too much yellow bile? Must be your nagging, fiery temper. They have an excuse for everything you feel, except truth. Here's your fringe fact. In several medieval medical texts, it was claimed that the womb could literally wander around your body, bumping into organs and causing madness. Yes, again with the wandering womb, a woman might feel faint or sad or even unruly, and the diagnosis would be your uterus is lost. Treatments included smoke, heat, prayers, or, in some cases, getting married and settling it with regular intercourse. Because what better cure for a misbehaving body than surrendering it to a man? And if something seriously goes wrong? If your body becomes inconvenient, too sick, too loud, too angry, then people start looking for explanations beyond medicine. You might be accused of harbouring a demon. Maybe you're possessed, or cursed. Or God is punishing you for pride, vanity, ambition. Because ambition in a woman is an infection, and the cure is silence. So you adjust, you minimise, you wrap yourself smaller, you speak less, you make yourself softer, gentler, easier to ignore. But no matter what you do, your body still makes people uncomfortable. If it's too attractive, it's a threat. If it's too aged, it's a burden. If it's injured, it's your fault. There's no right way to exist. You're always too much or not enough. And the worst part, you can't leave it. You live here, you are this body. You wash it, clothe it, feed it, bleed in it, birth in it, ache in it. And all the while, you're told it's not really yours. That God made it, but the world owns it. That your husband has dominion over it. That your children have claim to it. That your pain inside it is proof of your brokenness. There's academic debate about how women internalise these messages. Some argue that medieval women embraced the spiritual frame, that suffering was redemptive, that their bodies were temples for sacrifice, and others say women resisted more than we think, quietly defying expectations, keeping their own records, practicing their own medicine, sharing wisdom in whispers. Maybe both are true. Maybe you spend your whole life torn between shame and defiance, because you do know things about your body. You know when something's wrong before anyone else does. You know how to treat a fever with sage. You know how to ease a cough with honey and thyme. You know how to survive 10 pregnancies and walk the next day. You know how to kneel with cracked knees and still rise when someone needs you. That knowledge, it's real, it's power, but it's not the kind that gets written in books, so you pass it on. To your daughters, to your neighbours, in kitchens, in fields, in the margins of your daily life. You teach by doing, by surviving. You build a hidden legacy of knowledge, one the world pretends doesn't exist because it didn't come from a man with a quill. You carry that legacy in your scars, in your calluses, in your knowing glances when someone younger asks, "Is this normal?" You nod. You touch their hand. You say, "It is, you are." And for a moment, the shame lifts, because someone sees them, because someone saw you. Your body is not cursed. Your body is not weak. Your body is not a sin waiting to happen. It's a miracle they never bothered to understand. You keep your voice low. You always have. You learned early that a woman's voice isn't just something to be heard, it's something to be judged, controlled, feared, or punished. Say too much and you're gossiping. Say too little and you're hiding something. Say it wrong, say it loud, say it while not smiling. Suddenly you're a shrew, a harlot, a heretic. So you measure every word like it's coin. You spend them carefully. You pray they don't cost you your life. But even silence is risky. Stay quiet while something happens, while a neighbour's child starves, while the priest skims from the collection, while your husband drinks too deeply and roars in the street. And they'll say you're complicit. Or worse, you must have known, you must have whispered it. Because women always whisper, don't they? That's what they say. The assumption isn't whether you're speaking, it's what you're plotting. And that's where the real nightmare begins, the power of accusation. You speak up, that's dangerous. You speak truth, that's worse. You say what no one wants to admit. About how unfair things are, about who's hurting who, about what you saw in the forest last night. And suddenly, people look at you differently. Like you've got teeth instead of a tongue. Like you might grow claws next. Let's hit tonight's historical fact. In many medieval towns and parishes, women could be prosecuted for scandal-mongering, meaning gossip, complaints, or even public criticism. This wasn't just frowned upon, it was legally punishable. Penalties ranged from fines and public penance to brutal humiliation devices like the ducking stool or scold's bridle. So yes, if you talk too much, the town might literally strap iron to your face and parade you through the market. Still you whisper, in corners, over shared loaves, in church pews, under your breath. You warn a young wife about her new husband's temper. You grumble about taxes that bleed your garden dry. You tell your friend that you don't trust the man who watches the children play. You're not trying to stir trouble. You're just trying to survive with your eyes open. But word travels faster than you ever expect. And if you've spoken something someone doesn't want repeated, you're a target. Accused of gossip, of discontent, of stirring the pot. And you know how this ends. First it's a warning. Then it's a summons. Then it's a punishment designed to make you a lesson. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In parts of medieval Germany and the Low Countries, a woman convicted of gossiping might be forced to wear a shame mask, a heavy metal helmet shaped like a pig, or with an iron tongue poking out between metal lips. The idea was to humiliate you into silence, but often it just made people whisper more. Because here's the thing, they don't just punish you for what you say, they punish you for being the kind of woman who would say it. Independent, loud, curious, angry, grieving, ambitious. All of those are seen as signs of something darker, something unladylike, something unnatural. And from there it's a short jump to unnatural woman. And from there, witch. No, seriously, that word is never far from any woman's doorstep, especially one who won't shut up. The more you speak out, the more dangerous you appear. The more you question, the more they look at you sideways. You become a disruption in the order, a crack in the wall they've built around what a good woman should be. And they don't like cracks. Cracks let the truth in. Some scholars argue that gossip among women was one of the few ways information circulated in communities that excluded women from formal power. That it acted like a social web, a kind of informal resistance network. Others claim it was simply a byproduct of oppression, women finding ways to vent in a world where they had no direct agency. Both might be true. Gossip, like fire, is both warmth and risk. And here's the cruelest irony. Men gossip too, constantly. In taverns, at the marketplace, around hunting fires. But when they do it, it's called politics, debate, news, banter. When you do it, it's a threat to morality and order. So you learn to live with the tension. You learn to mask honesty in pleasantries. You trade secrets in bread loaves and glances and caution. You make your thoughts small enough to hide, but sharp enough to survive. You do what women have always done. You communicate in a language built of looks, silences, and words that carry double meanings. But some days you want to shout. You want to stand in the village square and scream until someone listens. You want to say out loud, I know what's happening. I see what's wrong. I'm not afraid to name it. But you are. You're afraid. Because in this world, being right isn't enough to protect you. Being honest isn't enough to save you. Sometimes it's the reason they come for you first. So you keep your voice low, but not gone. You pass what you know to the next woman. You tuck it into lullabies and recipe tips and warnings hidden inside compliments. You teach your daughters to listen carefully, to speak wisely, to know when to hold their tongues and when to risk it all. Because one day, maybe, the whisper will be loud enough to crack stone, loud enough to shatter rules, loud enough to remind the world we were never silent. You just refused to hear us. You weren't supposed to survive this long. Statistically, you should have died giving birth to your second child, or during your third winter of famine, or in that fever-slick week when half the village was coughing up blood. But here you are, still breathing, still waking up in the dark and lighting the fire, still stirring porridge, still whispering prayers, still you, somehow. And still, after everything, you found slivers of rebellion. You wouldn't call it that, not out loud, but you know what you're doing. Every time you question a priest under your breath. Every time you take a different route to the well just to have 5 quiet minutes. Every time you pass advice to another woman about herbs, about men, about pain. That's resistance, even if it's quiet. Even if it's dressed in an apron and spoken in a whisper. Because this world has done everything it can to break you, but you're still here. Tonight's historical fact is a glimmer of hope. A small but growing number of women in the later Middle Ages began carving out space for themselves, especially in cities. Some became merchants, running businesses when their husbands died or disappeared. Others formed guilds or informal collectives. In some places, midwives and healers became respected experts, even if the church side-eyed them. These women didn't lead armies or write books of law, but they built survival into their own kind of empire, the empire of daily life. And here's what the history books don't always capture: the way these women helped each other, quietly, fiercely, without ceremony or credit. A neighbour shows up with a bundle of garlic and a promise not to tell. A friend covers for you while you cry behind the barn. Your mother-in-law, who never said she liked you, slips a coin into your hand when she sees your pantry shelf is empty. These aren't grand gestures, but they're the reason you're still standing. Even in the convent, or the village, or behind the shadow of your husband's shadow, there's connection. You swap secrets with the other laundresses. You trade prayers with the old widow who keeps bees. You watch your sister's kids while she rests. You patch your niece's petticoat and tell her what not to say at dinner. None of it looks like rebellion, but every act of mutual care pushes back against a world designed to isolate you. Fringe fact for tonight. In parts of France and Italy, there were small groups of laywomen known as beguines, women who lived together in communities without taking formal religious vows. They weren't nuns and they weren't wives. They supported each other, cared for the sick, taught girls to read. For a time they thrived. Until, of course, the church realised that women living independent, spiritually motivated lives without male oversight was simply too radical and began to crack down. You've learned that the only real weapon you're allowed to wield is competence. You do things well. You grow food, mend clothes, deliver babies, keep the hearth warm, carry the stories. You keep everyone alive and you make it look easy. So easy, in fact, that men forget it's work at all. They think it just happens, that bread rises and children behave and socks fix themselves. But you know the truth. You've stitched survival into the seams of every day. You've carried grief on your back and pretended it was firewood. You've buried dreams you never got to name and raised children who may never thank you. And still you rise. There's debate, even now, about how much resistance medieval women could really offer. Was helping each other subversion or simply instinct? Were midwives and healers rebels, or just doing what no one else would? Did these small acts change anything? Maybe not history, but they changed your life. They got you through. And sometimes, late at night, you imagine another life. One where you get to study, to travel, to speak without permission, to wear what you like, to love who you choose. You don't imagine it wistfully. You imagine it as fuel, a little fire you keep burning in the back of your mind, because as long as you can imagine something better, they haven't won. You look at the girls in your life, your daughters, your nieces, the neighbour's child with the eyes like spring storms, and you think, maybe they'll get further than you did. Maybe the quiet things you did will echo forward. Maybe they'll read your recipes and realise they were maps. Maybe they'll whisper your name and know they came from someone strong. You won't be in the history books. You won't be crowned or canonised. But you'll leave traces, threads, scars, seeds. You were here. And that matters, because in a world that tried everything to erase you, you persisted. You didn't just survive, you helped others survive. You kept going even when it felt like drowning in mud and smoke and silence. You made a life out of scraps. That's more than most legends ever did. And even if no one remembers your face, even if no one carves your name into stone, someone, somewhere will live, because you did. And that is enough. You hear them say it sometimes. The Dark Ages are over. The plague has retreated, for now. Towns are growing, trade routes hum with traffic, universities open their doors to more boys than ever, and somewhere a man declares that Europe is entering a time of light, of reason, of renewal. A renaissance, they'll call it. But as you sweep ash from the hearth and wince at the ache in your hips, you think, darkness never left for women, it just changed shape. Because all the old rules, still here, women must still be quiet, obedient, invisible. You're still expected to die in childbirth without complaint, to survive on less food than your sons, to cover your hair before your soul. Your body still isn't yours. Your thoughts still don't count. And now, even as the world starts inventing printing presses and oil painting, they're inventing new ways to ignore you. The Renaissance man, with his flowing robes and love of ancient knowledge, writes treatises about human beauty and reason. Guess who's not included? You. Women are still Eve, still weak, still vessels for male lineage. Scholars are dusting off Aristotle and Plato and deciding that, surprise, women really are defective men. That was always the claim, but now it's printed more elegantly. Tonight's historical fact. In the 15th century, during the so-called dawn of modernity, a French court case debated whether women were actually human beings with rational souls. This wasn't satire. This was real legal philosophy, argued in actual courtrooms, by men with powdered wigs and very serious beards. And the verdict? Essentially yes, but let's not get carried away. Women were granted theoretical souls, but still no agency. And even as medicine advances slowly, painfully, it doesn't bring relief. It brings more tools to diagnose you, to dissect you, to declare what is wrong with you. They've stopped saying your uterus wanders. Great, now they're just claiming that your womb causes every known form of madness. Progress. Fringe fact for the night. Some Renaissance anatomists refused to draw female bodies in their anatomy books, or when they did, they labelled parts like the uterus as the hidden place. And they weren't just being poetic. The idea was that a woman's body was too shameful, too mysterious to fully describe. So even in diagrams of the human form, you're still blurred, still less than. The intellectual world is blooming, just not for you. Books are being printed, but not ones you're allowed to read. Languages are evolving, but no one teaches them to your daughters. Science is celebrated, but only when it confirms what men already believe. So yes, the Middle Ages are technically ending. But the nightmare? It keeps walking forward in a nicer outfit. And now they're painting women again. Idealised, romanticised, posed in frozen grace. You see yourself in these portraits, sort of. The curved neck, the blank eyes, the pale skin. But she's not you. She's someone's idea of you. A fiction. A decoration. You scrub chamber pots while a canvas version of you stares softly out from a nobleman's wall. She gets the credit. You get the calluses. Some say change is coming, and yes, there are ripples. Women who write under fake names, women who learn to read in secret, women who refuse arranged marriages, or open schools, or study herbs in the woods. There's Christine de Pizan, writing books in the 1400s about how women deserve respect and education. There's a growing number of midwives who record their methods and insist on their expertise. These are real, remarkable cracks in the wall. But you're still caught in the undertow. You wake up to cold floors and the weight of obligation. You care for the dying, raise the children, sew the future together with stiff thread and aching fingers, and no one applauds. No one writes it down, no one stands up and says, "This woman held an entire world together, while history forgot her name." Yet somehow you keep going. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all. The nightmare doesn't have a dramatic ending. No final confrontation, no big escape scene, it just continues. It gets better in some places, worse in others. It shifts its weight, changes its mask, adapts to the times. Some doors open, others slam shut. And through it all, women like you endure, not because you're given strength, but because you make it every single day. Some scholars say the Middle Ages were no worse for women than other periods, that patriarchy is a constant, just dressed in different clothes. Others argue that this era had unique cruelties, systematic, embedded, inescapable, and the truth is probably both. But that doesn't help you when your ribs hurt from another birth, when your name is left off another record, when your voice is turned into wind. So what do? You teach, you comfort, you joke with the butcher's wife, you give your daughter a book even though it might get taken, you slip an extra potato into the neighbour's pot, you survive on sheer nerve and a handful of quiet joys, a hot stone on your feet, the smell of a baby's hair, the way the sunrise colours the frost like sugar. You don't get a revolution, you don't get recognition, but you get moments, you get legacy. Not the kind that sits in a palace archive, but the kind that grows in the soul of the girl who comes after you. She remembers you, even if she doesn't know your name. She feels your story under her skin, and she walks a little taller because of it. You aren't free yet, but you're undefeated, and that counts for something. So here we are, 30 nights deep in candlelight and cobblestone, with soot on your skirts and a scream permanently stuck behind your teeth. If you've made it this far, if you've survived through childbed and firewood, through muttered slurs and iron bridles, through months without meat and centuries without credit, then congratulations, you're still breathing. And that might just be the biggest rebellion of them all. Let's be honest, being a woman in the Middle Ages was a horror show. Not always loud, not always dramatic. Mostly it was quiet cruelty, unrelenting expectation, a grind that wore your bones thinner than your name on parchment. People like to romanticize the era now, with the flowing gowns and dashing knights and all that courtly love nonsense. But you and I both know the truth. No satin sleeve or harp melody could drown out the sound of injustice scraping against your every day. But here's the thing, no one ever says loud enough. You mattered. Even if your name didn't make it into the record books, even if your words were erased and your portrait never painted, you were the backbone of the world that thought it could survive without you. You cooked, you healed, you held lives together, while being told you didn't have one of your own. And despite all of it, you loved. You laughed. You whispered the truth when you could, and kept it alive when you couldn't. And now, centuries later, someone's listening. Someone's writing your story, not as a footnote, not as scenery, but as the centre. We can't go back and undo what was done, but we can remember. And remembering is a kind of justice, a quiet, belated apology, a flicker of light passed from your hands to ours. So tonight, let the world go dim around you. You've earned a little silence, a little rest. You don't have to carry anything right now. Not the babies, not the basket, not the weight of being misunderstood. Let it go, let your shoulders drop. Breathe out, you're safe, you're seen, and you're finally home.